What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. So what I want to do here is begin getting into what I consider to be one of the best stories ever written in Marvel Comics, Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four. But because this story is so expansive and there's other things that I want to cover, this series will actually serve as a backdrop, and that in addition to my other videos, this series will be uploaded as well, allowing for 2-a-days until we finish. So instead of going through and providing a large narrative on why the story was written, instead, what I want to do here is provide this information as we progress through the series itself. And the reason why is that for Hickman's Fantastic Four, the series actually draws this emphasis from the entire history of the team, with special emphasis placed on Civil War. What I mean here is that with this story having started in 2009 and Civil War having been written in 2006, prior to Civil War, Reed's role within the Marvel Universe was largely that of an explorer and chronicler of science and technology. However, during the events of Civil War, and because the conflict was a symptom of a larger problem involving the warring nature of humanity, Reed Richards set about to quite literally solve the problem of everything. Opening up with Reed Richards and his father Nathaniel, this particular bit of the story is something I'd like you to keep in the back of your head, since the concept of father and son will be a recurring theme throughout this series, especially because the story itself largely emphasizes Franklin Richards. But this moment comes to us as a flashback to Reed's childhood. While we will learn more about the relationship between the two, within the realm of Marvel Comics, Nathaniel Richards first appeared in Fantastic Four number 272 as the father of Reed, albeit in an absentee form. However, with these original appearances from John Byrne, almost no information was offered about Nathaniel save the fact that he abandoned Reed Richards and his mother 3 years before the Fantastic Four gained their powers. What this expansion of Hickman does is establish that the moral compass of Reed in terms of his willingness to fail for the sake of discovering hails from the lessons handed down to him by his father, who plays a significant part in his life despite having been gone for so long. But following this flashback, we jump to the present day with the Fantastic Four facing off against a villain known as the Wizard. Now in truth, this battle is not really designed to play any major or significant part. Instead, this is simply designed to show us what the Fantastic Four are doing in the current day, and that this era of their lives has them fighting as superheroes. And so with the Wizard defeated almost immediately, after sifting through the robots of the Wizard, the Fantastic Four come to the realization that the Wizard himself has been building robots designed to work as proxies, carrying out his will through destruction. Now while this seems like the normal actions of a villain, after accessing one of the robot's self-destruct mechanisms and tracing the signal back to its source, Reed arrives at the Wizard's lair, only to discover that he's been systematically developing a race of robotic humans and children. While we don't know exactly what the purpose behind this is, Hickman provides us with an explanation when the story shifts its focus to the aftermath in the Baxter Building, where Johnny Storm and Ben Grimm go about their normal actions of jibing one another. During a conversation with Sue, Reed's mind jumps back to the Wizard who argued off-panel that humanity would inevitably destroy itself. Now again, this ties directly into Civil War, and that with Tony Stark operating as the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. and the 50-state initiative in place, which is to say, a government-sanctioned superhero team in all 50 states, because Civil War split the superhero community down the middle with the remainder of Steve Rogers' Avengers operating underground, the Wizard's claim of society's imminent destruction rings in the mind of Reed, who's put his brain to task and appears to have come to the same conclusion. And so taking to a room within the Baxter Building, which is off limits to everyone else, we discover that in addition to the litany of ideas in the mind of Reed, his top goal at the moment appears to be his desire to solve the problem of everything. Now this bit is extremely important because what Hickman's going to do is effectively turn the entirety of the Fantastic Four concept on its head. Stepping into a multidimensional bridge, something that I hope you notice is that if you see my videos on Time Runs Out, this looks almost identical to the device used by Reed to view the multiverse in an attempt to decipher why the multiverse was collapsing prior to Secret Wars. It's for this reason that if you choose to, the writings of Jonathan Hickman within Marvel Comics can actually be read in isolation and in chronological order, revealing a complete story unto itself, dealing with multiple facets of the superhuman community. That said, after initially speaking to a disembodied voice, we learn that these men are actually different versions of Reed from different realities. What we're told is that Reed Richards of Earth 6590 and Reed Richards of Earth 12 hail from realities where the Fantastic Four were exposed to the cosmic radiation that granted their powers, but instead of developing the power to stretch their bodies, one gained the abilities of Johnny Storm and the other gained the abilities of Susan Storm. Now, while Hickman will touch lightly on the fates of the other Fantastic Four members from each of these continuities, for the moment, Reed's taken before the Council of Reeds within a hall that exists outside of all space and time. As a result, the Council is able to perform their work within the hall without having to worry about negatively impacting the multiverse around them. In addition to this, after entering the hall proper, we learn that the Council consists of a litany of Reeds from different realities and with different powers. As an example, in one reality, Reed Richards is a mutant that leads the X-Men, but in another reality, he became the Silver Surfer or Doctor Strange. However, before being able to receive a proper tour and after the Council is alerted to an invasion of Earth by Galactus in the 2012 reality, Reed is greeted by 3 versions of himself, with each one wielding an Infinity Gauntlet. So with Fantastic Four number 571, the comic picks up where 570 left off, with the Council preparing to do battle against Galactus of Earth 2012. Now on its face, where this seems to be a massive conflict that 7 of the Reeds have assembled to face off against Galactus and 3 Silver Surfers, we actually learn that each of these Reeds is wielding an ultimate nullifier. Now to sidetrack for a second, if you recall my comic concepts video on the ultimate nullifier itself, we had talked about how the device serves to completely extinguish and eliminate anything in existence up to and including the universe. While I wouldn't say that this is a glaring plot hole, Marvel had previously established that there was no limit to what the ultimate nullifier could destroy within any given universe, meaning that a person with the intelligence and willpower of Reed Richards only really needs one. However, with there being 7 nullifiers here, the indication is that perhaps this version of Galactus is too powerful to be destroyed by a single nullifier, but it's entirely possible that Hickman missed this piece of information. But regardless of the reason for this, following the off-panel destruction of Galactus, we switch to Earth 8901 as Reed is being educated about the Council's purpose. What we're told is that the Reed from Earth 8901 initially put his mind to task of solving the universe's issue of hunger by terraforming a section of a barren and uninhabitable planet. While we're not told how this was initially done, what we are told is that over time, this 25 square mile patch grew to cover the entire planet and extended to other worlds within this universe. As a result, the Reed of Earth 8901 turned his sights to feeding the hungry throughout the multiverse by using the food from these planets to send supplies through an interdimensional portal to other realities. In addition to this, while Reed Richards from the Earth 8901 reality does possess an Infinity Gauntlet, the gauntlet only works in the reality that it hails from. Now this bit of information is extremely important, and the reason why is that prior to this revelation, the only information on the limits of the gauntlet came during the 2003 crossover JLA and Avengers, when Darkseid picked up the gauntlet but couldn't use it. However, with this statement, Hickman effectively wrote the limit of the gauntlet in stone, making it in continuity, which has remained an aspect of his existence ever since. Now from here, we jump to the Earth 45 reality on day 3 of Reed's education and pick up with the darker side of the Council. What we learn here is that because the Council exists to solve the problem of everything, not every solution is peaceful or honorable. Instead, the Council must occasionally delve into the realm of the unthinkable in order to keep the multiverse safe. In this instance, because every story that involves Dr. Doom sees him attempting to gain absolute power for the goal of ruling that reality, the Council had taken it upon themselves to capture each iteration of Dr. Doom which had aspired to evil. As a result, and within the tomb below the main Council chamber, are countless versions of Doom who have had inhibitor collars placed around their necks, which destroys higher brain functions and turns each version of Doom into a vegetable. Now on its face, this seems like an outrageous situation and a complete paradox to the role of the Council in serving as a guiding force for the universe, but in truth, I actually agree with it. To sidetrack for a second, when I was younger, I read a book called Injustice: What's the Right Thing to Do by Michael Sandel, and in it, he provided a scenario of a trolley train. In this situation, you're the conductor of a trolley when the brakes go out, and the only recourse you have is to adjust the tracks. If you stay on course, you'll kill 5 construction workers, but if you adjust course, you'll kill only 1. This situation falls directly in line with the utilitarian philosophy of doing the greatest good for the greatest number of people. However, the other side of this equation is the line drawing. If everyone who demonstrates incorrigible evil is stripped of their freedom, and the goal of the Council is to solve the problem of everything, then stripping everyone of their freedom is the only logical conclusion to eliminating war and conflict. Now, while this does spiral out into a ton of new arguments, I'm actually curious as to whether or not you all agree with the idea of the Council stripping Doom of his freedom and his mind. But following this situation, we transition to another flashback of Reed having a conversation with his father. Discussing his troubles at school, instead of the issue being that Reed is constantly picked on, the problem that he faces is that no one in school is able to keep up with him on an intellectual level, and that because of his intelligence, Reed feels like an outcast. Offering words of comfort, Nathaniel states that the intelligence Reed possesses is a struggle at his young age because he's not in a position to use it properly. But when the time comes to truly help the world, Reed will be able to expand beyond his own sphere of influence and help more people than he can imagine. And so, using this as a basis, on the 6th day, Reed is welcomed before the council and asked to make a choice to whether or not he's going to join the council and solve the problem of everything. However, before the council is able to successfully induct Reed into their ranks, the hall is besieged by unseen forces. Switching to one of the Reeds who makes mention that the bridge of the multiverse has been compromised, what we're told is that a member of the council had stumbled into the Earth 4280 reality and discovered that the Celestials of that universe had become mad with power. Instead of serving to explore and experiment, the Celestials instead used their combined abilities to destroy the reality's versions of Galactus, Eternity, and the other cosmic entities, after which they forced the inhabitants of the universe to worship them. And so as this video winds down, taking the council member and accessing his mind through telepathy, the Celestials learned of the council's existence and launched an attack with the intention of expanding their sphere of influence to all realities. So as we continue our discussion on Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four, instead of writing out a script for this, what I want to do is have fun with it. A script is usually a good idea if it's something like the little documentary thing that I'm doing for a history of the Marvel Universe. But I think with a story like this that I absolutely love, I think it's easier to just sort of run through it kind of off the cuff. So in the previous video that I had done on this, we had talked about how following the events of Civil War, Reed Richards had basically come to this realization that it was inevitable that humanity would destroy itself. And so because he was effectively the smartest person in the world, he had basically taken it upon himself to solve the problem of everything. Now, while Hickman doesn't directly give it to us, what he tells us is that somewhere along the line, Reed had developed a multi-dimensional bridge, meaning he could access other dimensions and other universes, and that after he had done this, he had begun speaking with disembodied voices, but didn't really know who he was talking to. But after getting in and talking to those individuals, he basically discovered they were alternate reality versions of himself who had come together to form something called the Council of Reeds, which is basically an amalgamation of all these different versions of Reed Richards who would all come together to solve the problem of everything. Now, where the first video covered how we were given a tour of these different realities and the different steps that were taken to solve the problem of everything, what Hickman does in this comic here in issue number 572 is basically show us how much hubris the council has. And what I mean here is that where hubris is basically just excessive pride or extreme arrogance, what Hickman's telling us is that because all these different versions of Reed Richards had taken it upon themselves to solve the problem of everything, they effectively saw themselves as fixers. Everything was within their ability to fix. But with these Celestials that appear from the Earth 4280 reality, we learn that's not the case. Now, in the last video, we had talked about how these Celestials hailed from a universe where they had gone mad with power. Instead of just being explorers and chroniclers of science and technology like in the current Marvel universe, they had come to the conclusion that because they were so powerful, they should rule that universe. The Mad Celestials had come together and wiped out that universe's version of Eternity and the other cosmic entities, and then forced the inhabitants of that universe to begin worshipping the Celestials. And so while one of these versions of Reed was housed within that reality and exploring, he had stumbled across the Celestials, and in turn, the Celestials basically took apart his mind, read his thoughts, and discovered the existence of the Council, and looked to use the various dimensional portals of this Council of Reeds to access other realities and essentially take over the multiverse. And so what this does is this picks up with those particular series of events, and it shows us that the Celestials are essentially laying waste to everyone. And what I mean is that none of these Reeds stand a chance. Now, this is very, very important here, and the reason why this is a big deal is because while these Reeds are running for weapons and different things like that, one of the first questions we would ask is that if 3 of these Reeds have Infinity Gauntlets, why can't they use them? Well, like we saw in the last video, the Infinity Gauntlets can only be used in the reality that they hail from. And because the Council of Reeds is located in this place outside of all time and space, the gauntlets don't natively work there. And so what happens is that one of the Reed Richards who has an Infinity Gauntlet speaks to another version of Reed whose body is essentially a portal to his native dimension. And so the Reed with the Infinity Gauntlet sticks his hand into the portal, which basically allows him to just dip his toe, so to speak, into his own reality, and by virtue of that, use the Infinity Gauntlet. But what's really funny about this is that it still doesn't work. Because the Mad Celestials appear to be so powerful, whether it's because they evolved differently or they absorbed other individuals isn't made clear. But because of the power that they possess, even if only a handful are wiped out, more just keep coming. Now, what Hickman is indirectly telling us is that because the Celestials in the main Marvel universe exist by way of literally planting their seeds in planets and then allowing the Celestials to emerge in those planets, Galactus was most likely destroyed when the Mad Celestials took over, meaning there was no one to consume the planets to keep the Celestials from being born. And so the result is that these Celestials most likely took over the reality, not in just power, but in sheer population. And so with the Mad Celestials laying waste to the Council and the main Earth-616 Reed Richards making his escape, he travels back to the Baxter building, closes the portal, barely making it out alive, and begins grabbing up different arms and armament. Now what I want to do here is I want to sidetrack away from what Reed Richards is doing for a second, and I want to focus on Franklin and Valeria. Now this is not wildly important for the events that are transpiring with the Mad Celestials, but it will be important later on. And the reason why is because all of this is basically about Franklin Richards. The entirety of Hickman's run is literally about Franklin Richards. I know it doesn't seem like it now, but as we get further into this and we start seeing Franklin Richards from the future, we'll begin to see just how important these events are to his character. And so what we're basically seeing is Franklin and Valeria just kind of enjoying themselves, messing around with the different artifacts around the Baxter building. Now, for those of you guys who are not familiar, Valeria is a character who is wildly intelligent. In fact, she's about as intelligent as both Reed Richards and Dr. Doom, despite the fact that she's just a child. And of course, Franklin Richards has the power to warp reality. But something that I want you guys to take note of here is that in this story and within this point in Marvel's timeline, Franklin Richards had already lost his powers. They had been burned out. And they had been since the original Abraxas saga when he resurrected Galactus and destroyed Abraxas. Now, if you guys are interested, we can have a discussion on that at some future point in time. But all we really need to know is that at this point in the story, Franklin cannot warp reality. He really can't do anything. He's effectively just a normal boy. Now at this point, we go back to Reed Richards as he's gathering different arms and armament together, and we actually pick up with Susan Storm. Now again, this element of Susan and the element of Franklin and Valeria is going to be important in the next couple pages. And the reason for this is that in the previous events, in the last video, we had talked about how Susan and Reed had had some bit of a falling out, and this was due to the fact that Reed was just constantly preoccupied. He basically wasn't paying attention to his family. And within Marvel Comics, Susan Storm is very family oriented. She's effectively the person that seems to be holding everything together. And so from her perspective, because Reed seems so isolated and so removed from her and the children, as well as Johnny Storm and Ben Grimm, it seems as though Reed doesn't care about them. Now, the reason why this is important is because as we transition back to the Council of Reeds, with Reed Richards traveling back to try to get everybody all the arms they need to defeat the Celestials, while they are successful in doing this, once the conflict is over, we end up finding out there's a much darker side to the Council of Reeds. And what I mean here is that in addition to the Council going through and essentially lobotomizing all these different versions of Dr. Doom, who had displayed evil that just simply couldn't be corrected, we also learned that these versions of Reed had all given up their families. From the dimensions that they hail from, in order to solve the problem of everything, it required the totality of their mind and the totality of their focus, and the result was that they basically abandoned their families. Now, this point right here is the entire crux of this story, and this is why the end result of everything is so important. And so, if there's nothing else that you remember from this story, please remember this one thing. But the way that we learn this is that with the version of Reed Richards who had accidentally run into the Mad Celestials and initiated this entire conflict in the first place, his conversation with the main Earth-616 version of Reed tells us that as time progressed, as they began to move away, as he spent less and less time with his family, Susan Storm from his reality began to get angry and eventually walked away from him. The children, Franklin Richards and Valeria Richards, did the same thing. Johnny Storm, Ben Grimm, it was all the same process. In addition to this, that reality's version of Captain America, the Avengers, all the Earth superheroes slowly began to forget about Reed Richards to the point that he didn't exist or people didn't know who he was. And so even if he were to go back, they probably wouldn't recall him, with the exception of his closest family members who probably wouldn't want to have anything to do with him. And so when the Earth-616 version of Reed is confronted with this information, he immediately says no. He says absolutely not. There's no way he's going to abandon his family for the sake of trying to solve the problem of everything, because for him, it's too important. Now, again, this is wildly important. This is very, very significant. These first few issues are really the foundation for everything, which is why I keep stressing how important they are. Now, the reason why Reed Richards chose to stay with his family is explained to us when we get another flashback with his father, Nathaniel. Now, this is actually a point that's kind of been dipped on occasionally over the course of Marvel Comics, but not really. In the previous video, we had talked about how Nathaniel Richards, the father of Reed, was basically absentee throughout his childhood. While there were moments where Nathaniel Richards had traveled and appeared and made his presence known to Reed Richards and even engaged with him a little while, for the most part, Reed grew up without a dad. And the result is that he knows how it feels to not have a father. And so for him to be given the option or to be told that he has to do the same thing his father did and abandon his family in order to solve the problem of everything, for him, it just doesn't work. He can't square that circle. And so what we find is that he begins to reflect on his experiences with Ben Grimm and Johnny Storm, his love for Susan Storm, but he also keeps the advice that his father gave him to be a better man than he was, to be a better father, to be a better husband. And so once Reed comes to this realization, he effectively steps out of his office and begins to reconnect with Susan Storm. With that being said, we're going to go ahead and bring this video to an end. We're going to wrap things up. And what we'll actually find in the next video is that the Fantastic Four from Hickman's run is actually going to start tying into other events. And while a lot of this isn't wildly important, we're going to go ahead and cover it anyway, just because there's a few things that pop up here and there that are again going to contribute to the larger story and towards the end events regarding the adult version of Franklin Richards returning to the past. So as we continue our discussion on Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four, we pick up now with issue number 574. And what I want to do, and at least what I've done in the last video, is in the description, I actually put a reading list as well as a link to where you can buy this on Comixology, because to be quite frank with you guys, these videos I think will be entertaining if you haven't read the Fantastic Four from Jonathan Hickman, but it's also something that I suggest you read on your own, just because you can do it at a leisurely pace, and there'll be a couple things here and there that I'll be required to pass over. But because the story is so good, again, this is something I highly suggest you guys buy. But with this particular comic, we actually start out with the birthday of Franklin Richards. Now, this is why I love Jonathan Hickman's stories so much, because he doesn't forget the small things. And what I mean here is that with the Fantastic Four being Marvel's original superhero team, they've been around for decades, and their stories have seen a multitude of different things take place. They've done everything from fight street-level heroes to take on Galactus and deal with cosmic and even multiversal level threats. There was even a story where the Fantastic Four went beyond the multiverse and visited the One Above All, which is the comic a lot of people reference when they say that the One Above All is Jack Kirby. But with Jonathan Hickman, he reminds us that despite the fact that they've done these incredible things, they're still human. They're still, on a basic level, people. They have thoughts, they have feelings, they have emotions, they have children to take care of. And with Franklin Richards, this is especially important. And the reason why I think this matters so much is with Franklin as a character, most anyone who's ever read anything about Marvel Comics or has a passing interest has looked at the character of Franklin and been enamored by the powers that he possesses. As a child, he's effectively able to control the Marvel Universe depending on who you talk to. He's actually the reason why characters don't age. But with the abilities that he displays, it's very easy to look over the fact that he's still a kid. And so with this birthday issue, what we get is Valeria Richards giving Franklin Richards a present, but then also revealing that this birthday party is a surprise birthday party. Now again, with this whole celebration, we see a mishmash of different characters show up. And while we don't need to go through all of them, some of the characters that seem to appear here are both Power Pack as well as Leech. Now, with Power Pack, for those of you guys who don't know, there was a point in time where Marvel was reaching out to the younger audience base, and I don't mean teenagers, I actually mean little kids. And what they did is they created a superhero team called Power Pack, which included Franklin Richards, but also had various other heroes involved. Now, I've got a video on Power Pack, I believe, that you're welcome to check out, and if I have that video, I'll post it in the description. But with the character of Leech, in my mind, I think he's actually one of Marvel's most powerful mutants. By his very nature, Leech is what's called a Morlock, meaning he has a physical deformity, which keeps him from being able to live on the surface, and instead, he lives in the tunnels. But the power of Leech is to actually shut off the powers of other people. And as far as we know in Marvel Comics, there's no limit to this. And so it could be that he could take on Apocalypse and suddenly just shut off Apocalypse's access to his powers, immortality, different things like that. He could take on someone with insane abilities. Whether or not he could stop Jean Grey from being the Phoenix is something we don't know. And I don't think that situation's ever been explored, although I would be interested to see that comic. But Leech is very formidable just because of the fact that he can turn off other people's abilities. But in addition to this, and something that I also like you guys to take note of here, is Spider-Man. One of the funny gags with this is that Ben Grimm basically introduces all the children to Spider-Man, and they react exactly the way we would expect them to. The kids say, "That's not Spider-Man," and of course, the real Peter Parker shows up. But the reason why this matters is I would like you to pay particular attention to how Franklin Richards relates to Spider-Man, because there is a beautifully written issue later on in this story where Franklin Richards spends time with Spider-Man, and we get some very in-depth views into how Peter Parker views his life after the death of Uncle Ben. But this relates to the fact that Johnny Storm will actually die later on, which is kind of a spoiler here. But that of course takes place during the Annihilation storyline, which again will tie in here in a little bit. But with Franklin Richards spending time with Spider-Man, they just kind of hang out, and there's really not a whole lot to go on here, not a whole lot to celebrate. Of course, he takes him on a ride through the town, which happens off panel. We don't really see that, but once the two of them return, we see a little bit of banter back and forth between Peter Parker and Johnny Storm. And this again, for those of you guys who are currently reading the Spider-Man run, is where a lot of this stuff hails from. Even though they're not necessarily the best of friends at this point in time, they are still extremely good friends. And so as we continue on with our run of Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four with issue 574, we actually pick up later on that night. And this is where the story gets cool. What happens is, because the technology of the Fantastic Four allows them to basically monitor everything that goes on within and without the Baxter building on a global scale, the building is met with a timequake condition red. Now, while Hickman doesn't tell us exactly what this means, we can basically just infer that somebody's opening a portal somewhere, and indeed, that's exactly what happens. But the individual that shows up completely incapacitates the Fantastic Four. Now, while he doesn't necessarily beat them, he puts up a force field that they can't get past. And when I was reading this, I was like, oh my God, who is this guy? Like, what's going on here? And we don't find out until later on. But what happens is, while Susan Storm tries to get past this, while Reed Richards puts his mind to the test, Ben Grimm tries to pummel through it. There's nothing they can do, but more notably, whenever they punch a hole through a wall to try to get around it, the force field expands to fill that hole. So they're basically never ever going to get through. But from here, we see Franklin Richards as a child actually step out into the hallway trying to figure out what's happening. Now again, one thing to keep in mind here is that Franklin doesn't have powers. He's just a young kid. He's just a boy. And so while the Fantastic Four call out to this guy and try to get him to stop, he murmurs something to Franklin Richards and effectively lifts him into the air. Now from here, the man goes into the bedroom of Valeria Richards. Now again, Valeria is a character who is wildly intelligent in the realm of Marvel Comics. In fact, she is right up there with Reed Richards and Dr. Doom, and is probably one of the smartest people, probably the #1 smartest person on the planet when everything's taken into account. And in fact, during Hickman's run of Secret Wars, Valeria Richards was the one that came to the conclusion that the incursions cannot be stopped. Reed Richards didn't come to that conclusion first, it was actually her. Now Reed, of course, didn't want to listen to it. He wanted to preserve his reality, but at the end of it all, he had to accept her calculations as being absolutely true. But what this man says to Valeria Richards is that the future must be avoided at all costs. Now again, this is classic Jonathan Hickman. This is really just him telling us stuff, and we have no clue what's going on. So if you feel yourself being confused, don't feel bad. It's the nature of Hickman's stories, but all of this will begin to make sense as things go on. Now, what he says to her is that there will be a war between the 4 cities, and that those who died cannot be forgotten. Now, this is something that I really want you to pay attention to, because the next thing he tells her is that all hope lies with Dr. Doom. And this is the craziest thing. This is the craziest situation. But again, all of this will be made to make sense. But what ends up happening is, as he begins to make his way out, he begins to leave. Valeria catches up with him, and she says, "Happy birthday," which tells us this is the adult version of Franklin Richards. And so once everything begins to calm down, once this version vanishes and the portal disappears, and Reed Richards, Ben Grimm, Johnny Storm, and Susan Storm get with the kids and they basically put them back to bed, the conversation becomes, who is that guy and why was he able to shut everything down? Now from here, we also take note of the fact that Valeria Richards has her own little calculations on how to solve the problem of everything. And while this isn't very important right now, this will be very important later on. But more notably than this, what we learn is that the words that the adult Franklin Richards muttered to his younger self was to rest and remember who he was. And this is why I love this story so much, or love this comic, because what's happened here is the adult Franklin Richards has woken up the powers of his younger self. Now, we'll actually learn later on that other things are happening, that he actually mentioned other things to him, and we'll learn there's a lot more to the situation than what's initially being revealed to us. But because Franklin Richards' powers have been restored to him, the first thing he does is create a pocket universe in the bedroom of his room. Now, how awesome is that? With that being said, guys, I really hope you feel the excitement in this comic because this is such a cool story, and it really only gets better from here. It just keeps going up and up and up, and it leads to this amazing finale. So as we continue our discussion on Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four, what we do here is we actually tie in to the events of Old Man Logan. Now this is really cool because a lot of people don't know that the Fantastic Four from Jonathan Hickman tied into Old Man Logan and actually followed up to it and told us what happened after the story came to an end. Now, something to keep in mind is that the Secret Wars version of Old Man Logan actually retconned this information from Hickman's Fantastic Four. And so this information in Hickman's run isn't really applicable anymore. For those of you guys who don't know, retcon is retroactive continuity. That means that somebody goes in and changes things, removes things. And so because the Old Man Logan Secret Wars event had basically provided new information, this information here isn't really relevant anymore with regards to the larger Marvel universe. But for the sake of our discussion and Hickman's run of the Fantastic Four, we can use this because it's still self-contained and it'll be very important to understanding the things that happen later on down the line. But for those of you guys who never read Old Man Logan, this was a story that was written as an alternate universe that basically depicted a world where the supervillains had taken over everything. What ended up happening here is that because humanity and the superheroes were not necessarily as powerful as the villains, there were always a multitude of circumstances whereby the villains could have taken over. But the reason why they didn't was because they could never work together. They had their own agendas, they were infighting, they wanted to destroy their own nemesis, or maybe they just simply wanted to take over the world, but for whatever reason, they thought only about themselves and they weren't thinking about other things. And so what ended up happening here is that within the realm, within the universe of Old Man Logan, under the leadership of the Red Skull, the supervillains of the world launched multiple attacks against the superheroes of the world at the same time, meaning the Fantastic Four, the Avengers, the Inhumans, the X-Men. They were all attacked simultaneously. Now, these attacks weren't necessarily done by brute force, which is to say the supervillains didn't just charge buildings and attack everyone. Instead, they used stealth, they used guile, and they used espionage to achieve their goal. Within the realm of Old Man Logan, within the context of Wolverine himself, what we're told is that the Spider-Man villain Mysterio had the ability to create illusions that manipulated the five senses, basically your sense of smell, touch, taste, so on and so forth. And so what ends up happening is Mysterio travels to the X-Men mansion and tricks Wolverine into believing that the villains of the Marvel Universe are attacking the mansion. And so Wolverine goes through and kills every last one of them. But once the illusion is revealed, we learn that Wolverine had actually killed all of the X-Men. And because of his healing factor, all of their attacks to him did no damage. And so with Wolverine realizing what it is that he's done, he actually goes into a state of isolation and refuses to pop his claws again. Now, following Wolverine's time away, the superheroes began getting killed off by the supervillains until there was no one left to stop the supervillains from taking over the world. Now, while we're only told what goes on within the context of the United States, what we know is that the country itself was divided into sections, with the Red Skull taking over Washington, D.C. and the surrounding areas in the Northeast, and everybody taking whatever else was left. And so while people like Magneto took over Middle America, Magneto himself was killed, with his section being taken over by the Kingpin. But in terms of Wolverine, while he's attempting to live a quiet life, he started a family of his own, but he lives under the rule of the Incredible Hulk. Now, following the events of these supervillains taking over the world, the Incredible Hulk Bruce Banner had actually mated with his cousin, She-Hulk, because as he explained it, she was the only one that he could procreate with. And so the result was that they produced a litany of incestuous kids. Now, where the events during Old Man Logan would have Hawkeye show up at the front door of Wolverine for the purpose of having Logan accompany him across the country in an effort to take super soldier serums to the various underground resistance groups in New York in order to improve their efforts to defeat the supervillains. With Wolverine being gone, we actually learn that the family of the Incredible Hulk killed his family. And so once the entire effort of the resistance movement is shown to have been a ruse by the Red Skull for the purpose of eliminating what was left of the superhero community, when Wolverine gets back home, he finds out that his entire family has been killed by Bruce Banner's family. And so in response, he pops his claws for the first time in something like 50 years and kills the Incredible Hulk, as well as virtually everybody else in his family, save for the Incredible Hulk's son, Hulk Jr. Now, where Old Man Logan ended with Wolverine taking Hulk Jr. and riding off into the sunset, we didn't know how things ended. We didn't necessarily know what came next. With Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four, it follows up to that. What we're told is that following this, Wolverine had basically initiated a giant resistance group, bringing together various humans and what was left of the superhero community that was in hiding, and led a revolution against all the supervillains of the world, killing them all and taking the planet back. And so where humanity spent the next several decades, even the next 100 years, basically going through and rebuilding itself, about 500 years after the events of Old Man Logan ended, Galactus returned and tried to consume the planet. Now by this time, Hulk Jr. is old, and he actually looks almost identical to the Maestro from the Incredible Hulk stories, which you'll find down in the description of this video. But what we learn is that the remaining superheroes, or those superheroes who have begun developing new powers and mutants who have emerged, basically lead an attack against Galactus, but a multitude of them are completely obliterated by the power that Galactus possesses. Now, while Galactus is defeated, because he's basically killed, what ends up happening is Hulk Jr. alongside various other individuals begin terraforming Galactus, turning him into an object that can be used to travel into the past for the purpose of preserving humanity. And the reason why is because as time progressed, whether the planet had been consumed by Galactus or not, it was going to become uninhabitable for a variety of reasons, and humanity would simply cease to exist. And so what this does is this actually jumps back to the present day, and we pick up with the Fantastic Four alongside a relatively new character named Alyssa Moy. Now, Alyssa Moy was introduced as part of Mark Millar's run on the Fantastic Four prior to Jonathan Hickman's run, and what Alyssa Moy was established as being was the girlfriend, or I guess the ex-girlfriend, of Reed Richards prior to his marriage to Susan Storm, and Alyssa Moy is actually as smart as Reed Richards is. And so the conclusion that Alyssa Moy came to was that by virtue of terraforming, by virtue of pollution, a multitude of other problems, the Earth at some point in the future would become uninhabitable. Now, this does not mean that Alyssa Moy knew that Old Man Logan was going to happen. In fact, Old Man Logan is now an alternate reality, so that future will not happen. But because of the fact that she believes that the Earth is going to become uninhabitable at some point in time, she, alongside a man named Ted Castle, who's also as intelligent as Reed Richards, had developed something called New World. And this was basically an artificially created planet Earth that would exist so that when the time came that the normal Earth was not habitable anymore, humanity could move from the normal Earth to New Earth and live there. And so what ends up happening is once Hulk Jr. and those various forces from the future travel into the past in an effort to save humanity, they encounter resistance from the Fantastic Four, who don't want their planet to be destroyed before it needs to be. And so what happens here is once the conflict begins to quell, once the Fantastic Four and Hulk Jr. and the various other forces begin to talk things out and realize what's going on, ultimately the Fantastic Four put the Incredible Hulk and those individuals on New World and then send them on their way. Now, the reason why I brought this up and the reason why this matters is that for those of you guys who were reading Time Runs Out by Jonathan Hickman, the events that led into Secret Wars, there was a comic whereby Captain America attained the time gem and began jumping forward in the future, and there was one instance whereby Ultron had taken over the world. That was not the Age of Ultron story. What that was Alex Ultron. During the events when the Incredible Hulk and those individuals in the future were trying to preserve their planet, there was one being named Alex Ultron who was actually the epitome of the Ultron program in terms of an individual, meaning that from the time that Ultron was first created by Hank Pym, up until that point in time, Alex Ultron represented the peak of the Ultron programming. And so what ends up happening is that once they're set on New World and they're sent off along their way, Alex Ultron begins to evolve and begins to grow to the point where it actually goes out on its own and then creates a planet Ultron in and of itself, and then eventually comes back to Earth and tries to take things over again. Now again, that was an alternate reality, but I just wanted to bring that up because I wanted to show you guys how everything in Jonathan Hickman's writing is all interconnected. But again, we'll get back into Franklin Richards' future self, restoring the powers of his younger self in the next video, because what we're actually going to find is there's a lot going on. There's all different kinds of things behind the scenes, and that this is really all just a story about a son trying to save his dad. So as we continue our discussion on Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four, what I'm thinking is that you guys are gonna freak as we get to this video, because if you guys are anything like me, I was reading through this comic and I was like, oh my God. And this is why I love Jonathan Hickman writing so much, because God, he knows how to tell one hell of a story. So in the last video, we had talked about how the old Man Logan story dealt with the death of all the superheroes and the supervillains taking over the world. And at the end of that story, Wolverine had basically taken the son of the Incredible Hulk as a newborn and went forward with the intention of creating a resistance to get rid of all the supervillains. And so what had happened is, in that reality, the supervillains were completely eliminated and society began to go back to a state of normalcy. But the problem here is that over time, the Earth began dying. And so the result was that those individuals in the future, though both superheroes and normal humans, had worked together to create a portal, to create a machine that would allow them to travel into the past in order to ensure their survival. But in order to power that machine, they had to take Galactus from the future, kill him, and then use his power cosmic to power the machine. And so the result was that once they achieved that goal, the future body of Galactus had fallen through the rift and landed in the present, which was discovered by Mole Man, who informed Reed Richards of what was going on. And so what we do is we pick up with this, and that Silver Surfer had discovered that Reed Richards buried the body of future Galactus, and Silver Surfer reported back to Galactus what it was that he had found, simply because this was such an important situation. And so what happens here is that Galactus from the present simply shows up on the planet Earth. And this is so cool because he doesn't go through a whole bunch of introductions. He doesn't do any threatening. He simply just shows up to Reed Richards when Reed Richards appears to meet Galactus, and Galactus just says, explain. And this, I think, is one of the perfect examples. It's so cool how Hickman takes concepts, takes like all these thoughts and emotions and feelings and throws them into a simple word. Because when Galactus just shows up and says explain, it denotes authority. It denotes, if you don't give me what I want to know, I'm going to destroy your world. I mean, it's such a cool series of things that go into this. But what Reed does is he effectively tells Galactus exactly what I just said a second ago about the future of the Old Man Logan universe and the travel through time. And the result is that Reed says that for him, it just seemed right to bury that version of Galactus. It didn't seem right to simply just leave his decaying corpse on the surface of the world. Now, while Reed doesn't necessarily say it either, I would imagine that to a degree, there would be panic. If, for example, the Avengers were just traveling around the world, or if the X-Men were just traveling around the world doing whatever the Avengers and the X-Men do in their off time, and they stumbled across the decaying corpse of Galactus on the surface of the planet, they would probably start freaking out, and they would be like, oh my God, Galactus is dead, and who knows who did it, and it would turn into a great big huge thing. And so it was probably kind of trying to eliminate panic, more or less. But the fact remains here that once Galactus is informed of everything that's going on by Reed, he tells the Silver Surfer to locate the new world that Reed had put the survivors on and sent them off to. And so once Silver Surfer locates New World, he tells Galactus exactly where it is, and Galactus says that they're immediately going to leave and they're going to go find New World and investigate for themselves. Now, this is all extremely important, and the reason why is because this deals directly with Franklin Richards, and this tells us why Galactus is afraid of Franklin Richards. What we find out is that with Johnny Storm showing up and trying to figure things out, trying to understand whether or not he needs to react in a defensive or an offensive capacity, when Reed tells Johnny that he's going to leave with Galactus, there's really no discussion here. There's no debate. There's no, well, let's talk things out and figure things out. Galactus wants to find out what's going on. Reed's going to go with him, and there's no two ways about it. And so what happens is that once the two take off, once the Silver Surfer goes with Galactus and Reed Richards to find out what's going on in New World, we pick up with New World. But something interesting to note here, and this is why I say this is all about Franklin Richards, is because when they arrive, Galactus makes mention to Reed about how fast he had left Earth. And Reed says, yes, he noticed that, but he figured that if Galactus was leaving the Earth faster than normal, there was probably a reason why, and Reed was simply going to wait and see whether or not that reason revealed itself. But instead, Galactus tells him directly. What he says is that he left the planet Earth in order to avoid a conflict that could have been catastrophic on a universal scale, meaning it could have laid waste to the universe. And when Reed asks what it is that Galactus is talking about, Galactus says that the barriers in Franklin Richards' mind have been removed, which of course was done by his future self, and that Reed and Galactus need to talk about Franklin. Now, again, this is a really big deal because Galactus says that he was afraid, basically. He left the planet Earth because he was afraid, and by combining those two things together, he left the planet Earth because he was afraid of facing Franklin Richards. Now, this doesn't mean that Galactus in and of himself is terrified of the ability that someone could have to warp reality, and in fact, this really isn't the case with Franklin. Franklin can warp reality, but it's the fact that Galactus is afraid of Franklin because of the things he's done in the past. Way back in the 1990s, during the Abraxas saga, when Galactus was killed, Abraxas took his place, but then Franklin Richards basically resurrected Galactus from the dead. The fact that he brought back a cosmic entity from the dead tells us how powerful Franklin is. At the same time, Franklin's a child, meaning that his imagination can run wild. He can create and manifest all kinds of different things that would wreak havoc on the world as a whole, and it could be that Franklin doesn't know how to undo those things. So he could manifest some force that would wipe out the universe entirely and then not be able to undo that. We've never really seen an instance where that's happened before, but it doesn't mean that it couldn't. Now, while we don't find out exactly what it was that Galactus and Reed Richards talked about, instead, Hickman actually just skips over that. Now, we'll find out exactly what it is that he's talking about once we see the Mad Celestial show up and Franklin Richards battle them. That entire scenario effectively speaks for itself, but more so than that, we'll actually see Galactus speaking directly to Franklin Richards about the power he possesses and what it is that he's capable of doing and how he relates to Galactus himself. But from here, we basically just show up at New Earth and we see that Galactus and Reed Richards are talking about everything that's going on. And so where Galactus initially asks how it was that New Earth was created, how it was all this came into existence, again, Reed Richards basically rehashes what we know about the future of the old Man Logan universe. And when Galactus asks whether or not Reed Richards can prevent this from happening, that is to say, he can effectively save that future from coming to an end, Reed begins to reflect on his time with the Council of Reeds, and he makes the case that yes, most likely he can solve this problem that would have resulted in the destruction of the future. The result is that because Reed would effectively be stopping those individuals from the future and having to come to the past in the first place and initiate this entire series of events, for Galactus, this world will simply cease to exist. And so instead of allowing it to pass, instead of allowing it to basically vanish without any real advantage, Galactus decides to consume it. Now, one of my favorite things here is that the occupants of New World initially protest. They say, no, Galactus cannot destroy their world, and Galactus's reply is, who tests God and does not wager their life, a price will be paid. And this is why I love Galactus so much, because this is just a cool thing to say. It's just a cool line to say. I like the way it sounds, to be honest with you guys. And I might even make like a wallpaper or something out of it, but I think it's a really cool moment. It's just nothing really significant here. It's just, these are one of the things that I like about Hickman's writing. And so basically the people on this planet, on New World, are given a chance to leave. What Galactus says is that he is going to consume the world. He's going to end all of it. But instead of simply just killing all those individuals on New World, what he's going to do is allow Reed Richards to get as many people off the planet as possible between the time that Galactus begins consuming his machine in order to consume the world and the time that he's done doing that. And so from here, what we do is we transition back to the future of Franklin Richards, and we pick up with his character after he had woken up the powers of his younger self. Now, I know that this is a lot of time traveling. I know this is a lot of bouncing around, but these things are extremely important for understanding the very end of this story and why things unfold the way they do. What happens here is we pick up with the adult Franklin Richards when he simply arrives in the future, and there's nothing here. It's just a giant expanse of white. We don't really know what's going on here. There's no planet. There's no greenery, no buildings, no nothing. It's just total emptiness. And the question is asked by an individual that we can't see whether or not Franklin was successful. And what he says is yes. He had basically woken up the powers of his younger self, removed those mental blocks, and so now the younger Franklin Richards has the power to warp reality. In addition to this, the adult Franklin Richards had told Valeria that all hope lies in Doom. Now we'll find out why Dr. Doom is such an important part of Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four, but what we learn is that the adult version of Valeria is also here alongside the adult version of Franklin Richards. And so what we're told is that the entire basis behind this, the entire premise behind the adult Franklin Richards going into the past, was performed by the father of Reed Richards, Nathaniel. Now again, when we started Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four, we had talked about how the father of Reed Richards, Nathaniel Richards, was basically absentee throughout almost his entire life. He didn't really spend much time talking to his son because he wasn't there. While he was part of Reed's life when he was very, very young, Nathaniel had simply just vanished for reasons that weren't really explained. What Hickman's run of the Fantastic Four does is it basically fills in the gaps, and it simply says that at this point, all they can do is just see how things unfold. Now again, this is really just very confusing here because the indication seems to be that this future is coming to an end and that some window, some opportunity is effectively closing with each moment that passes, and this seems to be their last-ditch effort to ensure that this future does not come to fruition. Now again, we don't really know what this future is, we just know that something's going on and they're trying to keep it from happening. And so while Valeria travels back and she effectively leaves, what Franklin Richards does as an adult is he manipulates this pocket reality, this little dimension that he's created, due to the fact that apparently because the future is coming to an end, this is a safe space, that time will change, time will pass, but instead things will stay exactly the way they are, the way he's making them within this small space. Now this is all metatextual stuff, this is all metatextual commentary, and it can be a little bit daunting, but things will make sense. And the reason why is because Nathaniel Richards actually jumps into the past to visit Reed Richards when he was in college alongside Ben Grimm. And while they were together, while they were spending time with one another, what Nathaniel does is he basically explains why he was gone for so long. What he says is that at some point along the line, he and a multitude of other Nathaniel Richards were pulled into a singularity to battle some individual with immense power. And because of this, Nathaniel himself had gained the ability to control time, to manipulate time. The downside to this was that in the far distant future, time itself was controlled by a man named Immortus, and it was monitored by the Time Variance Authority, meaning that individuals who meddle with time are strictly punished. And so the result is that because both Nathaniel Richards from the main Marvel universe and all the other alternate reality versions of Nathaniel had all developed the ability to manipulate time after battling this foe, they were all brought forward to Immortus, and they were basically instructed that not all of them can have this power, only one of them can. But because the power is part of them on a genetic level, it can't be removed, meaning the only way to ensure that only one of them can have the power is to eliminate every version of Nathaniel Richards except for one. And so what this did is it initiated something called the Great Hunt, and it was basically all these different versions of Nathaniel Richards from across the cosmos hunting each other down and trying to kill each other. And so for those of you guys who read Spider-Verse and you followed the events with the Inheritors chasing down all the different versions of Spider-Man and Spider-Woman from across the multiverse, this is the equivalent of that, except it would be as if all the Spider-Men were hunting each other down. And so what ends up happening is Nathaniel petitions Reed Richards to basically help him take care of the last version of Nathaniel so that the main Marvel Universe Nathaniel Richards will be the last one left. Now while Reed himself is extremely intelligent during his college years, he's nowhere near as intelligent as Dr. Doom. Now this will change over time due to the fact that Dr. Doom's arrogance will actually get the better of him. But at the moment, Reed is still smart, but Doom knows a little bit more about both technology and the ability to manipulate time. And so what ends up happening is Nathaniel Richards and Ben Grimm and Reed Richards and Dr. Doom from the past, from their college years, basically travel back into the future, and they encounter this second to last remaining version of Nathaniel, this evil version of himself. Now, where this isn't super important, where this isn't necessarily the most important thing coming out of the story, it actually is the basis for why Franklin Richards is doing the things that he's doing. And what we find out here is that with these versions of Nathaniel battling one another, ultimately it all comes down to this very notion that Nathaniel is going to be the last one left. He essentially kills all the other versions of himself. And so with these two versions of Nathaniel Richards battling one another, the conflict essentially goes exactly the way that we would suspect, in the sense that there's some give and take. There's the possibility that the main version of Nathaniel Richards will lose, but ultimately he ends up coming out on top with the help of Reed Richards, Ben Grimm, and Dr. Doom from the past. And so while they're successful in killing this other version of himself, Nathaniel Richards is basically the last one left now. The main version of Nathaniel Richards is the only iteration of himself. Now, having said that, what we do now is we pick up with Nathaniel traveling back to the future to meet Franklin Richards. And this is extremely important. And if there's nothing else that you remember from this story, please remember this. What ends up happening here is that Franklin begins to talk with Nathaniel, and he asks him, were you successful in killing that other version of yourself? And Nathaniel says yes. And so the result is that Franklin says perfect and destroys the reality around Nathaniel. And what this does is it tells us that Nathaniel himself is almost powerless catalyst to stop everything that's going on, that he doesn't even really understand why it is that Franklin's doing this. And what Franklin says is that, one, he disabled the ability of Nathaniel to use his own powers by controlling both reality around him and manipulating his brain, but also that when Nathaniel engaged in the Great Hunt and began killing off all the other versions of himself, that he made all those alternate reality versions of Reed Richards fatherless. And the reason why this is a big deal is because in our earlier versions of Hickman's run of Fantastic Four, we had talked about how those alternate reality versions of Reed Richards had created the Council of Reeds and abandoned their families because they didn't have the guidance of their fathers. And the reason they didn't have the guidance of their fathers is because this great hunt took place and their fathers were killed off. And so what Franklin is doing here is he's not really gaining revenge on Nathaniel. He's basically saying that Nathaniel in and of himself is the reason why all this happened in the first place. And so what we do, and something you may have noticed as we were going through this comic, is we actually saw some discussion between Valeria and Susan, and we pick up with that. While there is a lot of fluff that goes on in the two of them talking, which is really just a mother relating to her daughter, or at least Valeria relating to her mother in her younger form, not everything that happens here is extremely important. And in fact, the only thing that's really important is what she says to Susan Storm at the end. What Valeria tells her is that when everything seems like it's darkest, when everything seems like it's going to end and all hope seems to be gone, that Susan Storm is going to have to hold on. She's going to have to keep fighting despite the fact that the circumstances seem bleak. But at the moment that she does that, at the time when everything seems like it's going to crack and it's going to fall to pieces, that something will come to save her. Now, we find out what that something is again at the end of this story. I know it seems really, really wild, but this, yeah, it's it's awesome what happens. I'm almost inclined to spoil it because I've done it before, but I don't really want to. Those of you guys who have read Hickman's Fantastic Four, please don't spoil this. Please don't tell people what happens. But in the end, what ends up happening is that Valeria effectively departs. As things begin to come to a close, she takes off and she goes back with Franklin Richards. And what we find out is that something had happened in the past that began this wave of destruction throughout the multiverse, and the multiverse itself was effectively collapsing. And this pocket universe that Franklin had made was designed to keep space-time separate from around them. But the issue with this is that Franklin himself can warp reality, but in order for him to be able to warp it, he has to be in control of it. And the issue is that if reality is operating outside of his control, he can't do anything to stop it. His powers effectively work against him. And that seems to be what's happening here. And so as the two of them begin to get sucked into this rift, what ends up happening is they jump through, and then we actually won't see or hear from them until the very end of this story. But with that being said, we're going to go ahead and bring this video to an end. Let me know what you guys think about Hickman's Fantastic Four. Again, as with the last video, I know this can be a little bit daunting and things will actually be a lot easier to understand going forward. But again, I promise all of this will make sense once we get to the end, and that's the nature of a Hickman story. Hickman stories draw threads from all over the place. They pull threads from everywhere, and nothing seems to make sense. But then at the very, very end, he writes a single comic that wraps all that stuff up, and then you just get the light bulb effect. Oh, I understand what he was doing. That's exactly what ends up happening. So don't worry, guys. Everything will make sense at the end of this, which will probably happen in the next 3 or 4 videos or so. We've got a few more things to cover, especially with the death of Johnny Storm and the future of Ben Grimm. But aside from that, we can actually sort of jump towards the end and then just fill things in according to whatever seems to be interesting. So as we continue our discussion on Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four, we pick up now with the Fantastic Four issue number 579. Now this and issue number 580, these are what we call filler issues. These are not wildly important to the overall happenings of Hickman's Fantastic Four, but the reason why we're covering them is because there are events that will transpire later on in his run of the Fantastic Four that will require us to know about this. The first is that Spider-Man will become part of the events, but also Dr. Doom will become part of the events. But the other half of this is that Hickman is going to launch a story called the Future Foundation. And the Future Foundation will basically be a tie-in to his run of the Fantastic Four, and it'll be like Batman with Detective Comics, where it gives us the other half of what's going on with regards to the events as they're transpiring. Now, with this story, what we're told is that Reed Richards has journeyed to Golden, Colorado to pick up with something called the Singularity Conference. Now, the Singularity Conference does actually exist. I wouldn't say say this is something like TED Talk, but as far as I understand, it is basically a research conference. It involves some of the top minds that focus on artificial intelligence. Now, again, I'm not really knowledgeable about it, so I can't offer too much on that discussion, but what I can say is that within the Marvel Universe, as far as Jonathan Hickman's run of the Fantastic Four is concerned, the Singularity Conference was created by Reed Richards in Marvel Comics, and it was designed for the purpose of bringing the world's top scientific minds together to basically solve the world's problems, to move the world in a more progressive and prolific direction. But the issue here is that Reed Richards has yet to see this conference do this. And what I mean is that as he's talking to them, of course, he praises She-Hulk for the fact that, being in the legal profession, she's basically written articles about the laws of artificial intelligence and about the laws of technology and how they relate to what goes on in the world at the moment. But for Reed, this was designed to genuinely be a technological masterpiece. But instead of being that, the individuals who are part of the Singularity Conference have basically allowed their politics to run the show. Instead of writing articles and instead of focusing on, is artificial intelligence a realistic goal, or are advances in technology a realistic goal, it's turned into an argument of is artificial intelligence and is technology, are those realistic goals insofar as their political views about religion and I guess various social issues around the country. And the result is that Reed's basically come to the belief that they've all failed at their task. They've all failed the conference and they failed their purpose. And so what Reed Richards ends up doing is he doesn't really disassemble the entire concept of the Singularity Conference. Instead, he leaves. He basically quits. He walks away and says that everything is all said and done. And so the following week, what we do is we pick up with his arrival back at the Baxter Building. Now, we're not really told what he was doing during this time, and we don't really need to know. But what is important here is that after talking to Johnny Storm, after talking to the various members of the Fantastic Four and just kind of associating with them and being welcomed back, what we're told is that he's basically reached out to the smartest people or the smartest children in the Marvel Universe. So he's reached out to his own children, Franklin and Valeria. Now, I wouldn't say Franklin is one of the smartest people in the world, but because of the fact that he's a child of Reed Richards, of course, Reed Richards is going to bring his son into the fold. But Valeria, as we discussed, is genuinely extremely intelligent. She's as smart as Reed Richards, if not smarter, depending on what it is that's going on. But the reason why she has the edge and the reason why all these other kids were brought in as part of this group is because they have imagination. They're not restricted by politics. They're not restricted by how they want the world to be. They're restricted by how they look at the world. And so to them, there is no limit. Anything can happen. Anything can be done. And this is exactly what Reed was looking for. And so after talking to these various individuals, after talking to the various students, and when them asking the question, why are they all there? What Reed says is that they are the Future Foundation. They're there to basically help him solve the problem of everything, but more so than that, to basically look to the future, to look to the horizon, and to move the world into a better direction. Now, the reason why I brought this up, and this is actually kind of a sub-story, this is a side story that's actually going to be pretty interesting later on down the line, and it will tie into Reed's failing in attempting to solve the problem of everything, is basically the events of Ben Grimm. For those of you guys who have looked at Ben Grimm historically as a character that's routinely been a part of the Fantastic Four and always fought alongside them, you may see him in a couple different ways. You may see him as a character who's basically just kind of the comedic relief. He cracks his jokes and he calls it a day. You may look at him as the strong guy of the team. He basically is not really the hired muscle, but he's basically the muscle of the team. He does what the other members of the team can't do when it comes to sheer strength. But one of the major cornerstones of Ben Grimm's character is that he's always struggled with the fact that he can never go back to the way he was before. Now, there have been attempts made by Reed Richards to basically cure him, but they've always failed. And in some instances, they've been catastrophic in the sense that they've completely changed the way Ben Grimm looks. And in fact, if you go look at some of the John Byrne artistry on the Fantastic Four, there was one point in time whereby his physical appearance became very edgy and very rocky in the sense that instead of looking kind of smooth the way he does now, he had a lot of sharp edges. And the reason why is because that was a result of Reed Richards meddling around and attempting to cure him. And so what happens here is the first task of the Future Foundation is to try to cure Ben Grimm. And this is one of the coolest things about this, because this is Hickman basically telling us that, again, these kids have unbridled imagination. There's no limit to what they can do, but more so than that, they're better working as a group than they are as individuals. And this again highlights the limit of Reed Richards. Reed Richards is just one man. He can only look at the world through his own eyes. But with a group of kids who have unlimited imagination, putting their minds to task, they can effectively solve anything. And what we find out is that Valeria Valeria begins speaking with Ben Grimm, and they initially present the idea of returning him back to his human form, of basically making him normal again. But Ben Grimm again shies away from it just because of his checkered past with Reed Richards attempting to do this. And so what we're told by both Franklin and Valeria and a couple other kids is that the problem with Reed Richards trying to cure Ben Grimm is he wasn't looking at Ben Grimm for what he was. He was looking at Ben Grimm's entire change as something on the surface as opposed to a fundamental change. And this is actually really cool because Hickman gives us a little bit of modification on the powers of the Fantastic Four. For the longest time, when the Fantastic Four had their abilities, Reed Richards stretching, Johnny Storm being able to, set himself on fire and so on and so forth, we always had this notion that maybe it was just something that Reed and that Susan Storm and that Johnny Storm could control. They tapped into some aspect of their brain and they were able to manifest these things. But what Hickman tells us through the Future Foundation is that this is not the case, that basically Johnny Storm, Susan Storm, and Reed Richards have like an on-off switch for their powers, but they're still a genetic part of who they are. So when it comes down to the very fundamental, the core level of the Fantastic Four, in a lot of ways, they're no different than the X-Men. The only difference here is that instead of a gene activating that caused their powers, instead their bodies were modified on the genetic level. And so the result is that Ben Grimm does not have this on-off switch. He doesn't have the ability to modify his genetic code. And so what Franklin Richards and what Valeria Richards and the rest of the Future Foundation do is they basically say that they've come up with a way for him to do this. They've come up with a way for him to effectively turn his power off. And what they do is they present him with a substance, with a chemical of sorts that he can consume and that will make him human for only 1 week. Now, this is extremely important. And the reason why is because in the next video, and what we're actually going to do in the next few discussions or so, is one, we're going to talk about the death of Johnny Storm, but two, once we get further into this and we actually get into Nathaniel Richards visiting Reed Richards again, we're going to learn that there's actually a lot more to this substance. And not only is it going to make Ben Grimm human for a week, it's actually going to have unforeseen consequences. And this is gonna, again, be Hickman's way of telling us that Reed Richards doesn't know everything. And despite the fact that he has a Future Foundation, and despite the fact that these kids are all working together, in the end, they're actually going to screw up the life of Ben Grimm. They're going to, they're going to basically destroy it. Ben Grimm doesn't know it, they don't know it, and they won't know it for a little while. But it's actually a really cool series of events, and it's actually really interesting the way this whole little bit unfolds. And again, I really consider this to be just a great element of Hickman storytelling. It's just a cornerstone of storytelling. This thread doesn't go anywhere. It just shows us how things will turn out at a future point in time. However, following this, what we do is we pick up with Valeria Richards a short time later when she goes to visit Dr. Doom. Now, this little bit of the story actually requires some expansion on a few previously existing concepts. They're not wildly important, but they give us an idea of what's going on. During an event called the Fall of Hulks, which dealt with a group called the Intelligentsia, what we were told is that at some point prior to most of the large events have been going on in Marvel Comics, some of the smartest supervillains in the history of Marvel Comics had basically banded together as a sort of Illuminati-esque team of their own. And they had planned world domination and different things like that, but they were responsible for the creation of Red Hulk and so on and so forth. But the fact remains that Dr. Doom had been a part of their plan to basically take over everything. But during this conflict, as part of Fall of Hulks Alpha, Dr. Doom had been captured alongside Reed Richards and a handful of other superheroes who were considered to be the top 8 smartest individuals on the planet Earth, which is actually where that list comes from when people talk about the smartest individuals in Marvel Comics. And what had happened was Doom's intelligence had effectively been siphoned off. Now, we didn't initially know this, and in fact, we didn't really know the outcome of it. All we knew was that Doom had seemed to have been shaken up by everything that was going on. And so what happens is that as Valeria Richards is making her way out of the Baxter building, she stumbles across the laboratory of Reed Richards and the portal that he had created that granted him access to the Council of Reeds. And what happens is she basically begins going over the holographic logs of Reed Richards where he talks about everything that had happened. And what Valeria learns is that not only was Reed trying to solve the problem of everything, but she also learns that she can basically access this particular portal. And so what happens here, and this actually takes place off panel, though we find out later on what all had taken place, she basically accesses the portal. And so what happens is that once she's done, she leaves and she comes back to converse with Dr. Doom. Now, once we pick up with Doom, he's basically reflecting on how his intelligence had been siphoned away by the Intelligentsia. And because of the fact that he's partially damaged damaged, he basically reaches out for the purpose of taking his adopted son, Christophe Bernard, and assimilating the intelligence of Christophe Bernard, and in turn, basically using him to restore himself. Now, this tells us how sinister and how dark Dr. Doom is, but it also makes him really cool. I can't tell you exactly why, but there's something to be said about Dr. Doom willing to just kill innocent people for the purpose of ensuring his own legacy, of ensuring that he continues on. But before this plan can be fleshed out, before he can decide what it is that they do next, Valeria Richards appears. And so what happens is she begins talking to Dr. Doom. Now, something to keep in mind here is that when Valeria Richards was born to Susan Storm, Valeria Richards and Susan were going through birth complications, and it was actually Dr. Doom that effectively saved her life, that made it possible for Valeria to be born. And so he's sort of an uncle to her. He's basically a very close member to her, but even more so than that, and this is why I love Hickman's writing so much, is because she looks at him not really as a role model, but as a person whose intelligence is equal to, if not occasionally, a little bit less than her own. And so because of that, when it comes to the mind, he's an equal to her. And so she views him as maybe somebody she can consult. And that's what she's doing here. Because of the fact that the future Franklin Richards had appeared to Valeria and said, all hope lies in Doom, she's basically fulfilling this pact. She's finding out what it is or why it is that all hope lies with him. Now, again, she doesn't know how the future is going to turn out, but her logic dictates that if the future version of Franklin was going to come to the past and tell her all hope lies with Doom, then she better go visit Dr. Doom. And so what ends up happening here is that Dr. Doom, of course, she explains what all had gone on with her father, with Reed Richards creating a portal that allowed him to access the Council of Reeds. And when Dr. Doom asks what it is that she found when she went through the portal, but she shows us that some of the Reeds had been killed, that this Council of Reeds at this temple had basically been in total shambles. And what she tells us is that the Council of Reeds have effectively been destroyed in their entirety, or at least they appear to have been destroyed in their entirety. But she also says, and this is actually a very, very important thing, she also says that there are a whole bunch of versions of Dr. Doom that seem to have been lobotomized, and they're just living below the facility itself, the council chamber itself. And so when she travels into the building, she actually discovers that the Mad Celestials are still there, and the battle is still raging on, albeit with whatever few forces happen to be left behind. And so while these versions of Reed are doing what they can, in the end, again, it's just not enough, because we're talking about entities from a different reality that possess universal level power, that possess astronomical power. And so what ends up happening here is, while it's completely textless, while we don't really know everything that's going on, we know that Valeria is trying to help them, that most likely she talked to them, but we're not given the full explanation of what all had taken place. And this is actually interesting. I'm not really sure why Jonathan Hickman chose to go this route. I wouldn't go as far as to say it was a bad decision. It's just the effect that he was looking for was kind of lost on me when I was going through this. But what she tells Dr. Doom is that in the end, Reed made the wrong choice. And this is actually really interesting, because had Valeria made the decision, things would have been vastly different, and we actually would have seen the future of Franklin coming to fruition. But what she says here is that her father had the choice between solving the problem of humanity or else basically keeping his family. And because Reed chose to stay with his family, because he chose not to take the same road that all the other Reeds in the Council of Reeds chose, which was to basically abandon their families, that in the end he made the wrong choice and he screwed up. But more so than that, what's funny with this is that Valeria says that she notices something is off about Dr. Doom. Now, she does not know about the Fall of Hulk storyline. She does not know about those events as far as I'm aware. All she knows is that by virtue of the fact that Dr. Doom is twitching a bit in one of his hands, because of the fact that he is perspiring, because of the fact that he's showing characteristics that do not exude the normal kind of confidence that he puts off complete control of the situation, that something's not quite right. And Valeria immediately deduces that he has brain damage. And so the agreement that the two of them strike is that she will find a way to cure Dr. Doom's brain damage if Dr. Doom agrees to basically help Reed Richards whenever the time comes when that help is needed. Now, we will actually find this out later on following the death of Johnny Storm, and Dr. Doom is actually going to join the Future Foundation, which makes some really cool storytelling. It creates for some really cool dichotomy between himself and the rest of the Fantastic Four and the superheroes. So as we continue our discussion on Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four, what we do now is we pick up with the death of Johnny Storm. Now, Johnny Storm dying was a huge deal. It was a very big deal. And the reason why is because throughout the history of the Fantastic Four, the only person who ever really died, kind of, was Ben Grimm. And that was why we saw the Fantastic Four traveling to the realm of the One Above All. And that's where we learned that the One Above All is effectively Jack Kirby, or at least some people say it's Jack Kirby. In all honesty, it could be Jack Kirby or Stan Lee. It's just people cite that because it was in comics. I can't really blame them for it. But the fact remains that with the death of Johnny Storm, this is actually preluded by an event called the War of the Four Cities. And if you guys recall our discussions in the early videos on Hickman's Fantastic Four, we had talked about how the future version of Franklin Richards had traveled into the past to visit his younger self and wake up his powers, but he had also told Valeria Richards that there was going to be a War of the Four Cities. Now, within this story, we pick up in part with the Future Foundation. Now, in the last video, we talked about how the Future Foundation was a group formed by Reed Richards using children. And the reason why he wanted to use children is because they're not impacted by the world's politics. They don't make their decisions based off religious motives. They don't care about political allegiances. All they care about is what their imagination can let them achieve. And so they're effectively untainted by the real world. And so using children allows Reed to basically do whatever he wants to when it comes to the idea of trying to solve the problem of everything, about trying to make the world a better place. And so with this War of the Four Cities, we're actually going to have to delve into some history of Marvel Comics. Now, a lot of this is currently being covered in my series, A History of the Marvel Universe, but some of the stuff we're going to talk about, we haven't gotten to yet. Now, with regards to the first of the four cities, this is Old Atlantis. Now, in Marvel Comics, way back in the day when the Earth was basically new, when life was appearing for the very first time, the Celestials showed up on Earth and they began experimenting on humans, on primitive man. And they created the Deviants and they created the Eternals, and then they left normal humans alone, save for the fact that the genes of normal humans were modified so that at some future point in time, they would begin developing superpowers. For some people, this was a predisposition towards being bitten by a radioactive spider and becoming Spider-Man instead of dying. For other individuals, it was the activation of a gene that would grant them powers, which was the case of mutants. But the fact remains that with this period in time, those humans who were not enslaved by the Deviants after the Eternals had basically bailed off, began forming their own cultures and their own civilizations. And the central hub, so to speak, of civilization on Earth at the time was Atlantis. It was a giant trading hub. Technology was advanced far more than it is right now in Marvel Comics, which is interesting, and we'll explain why here in a second. But it was this massive interweaving. It was like the Roman Empire before the Roman Empire. And so what ended up happening here is the Celestials came back to basically see how their work, how their experiment was progressing. And the result was that the Deviants believed that the Celestials were wanting to take over the world. And so the Deviants attacked the Celestials. Now, while this was happening, the advanced citizens on Atlantis realized that this conflict would likely lay waste to the surface. And so what they did is they immersed their city in domes of an unknown composition in preparation for the coming destruction, and that's exactly what happened. The war between the Deviants and the Celestials initiated what's called the Great Cataclysm, basically meaning that almost all technology was wiped out and Atlantis sank to the bottom of the ocean. And so once Atlantis dropped off, you had various themes and various groups that were forming, but within Atlantis you had a subsect of people that carried on the tradition of the old ways. They never let go of the past. This continued on until the modern day, and this is part of the War of the Four Cities. These people who hold on to past traditions, who don't really follow the ideologies of Namor the Submariner, have come to the conclusion that it's high time that Atlantis take over the surface. They basically return back to the surface world and begin conquering all over again. And so what's going to happen here is that they are going to find themselves in a conflict with what are called the Universal Inhumans. Now, after the Celestials had showed up on Earth and meddled with the genes of humanity, the Kree race on the far side of the universe had realized what was going on. Of course, they had been fighting the Skrulls for quite some time, but because the war took place across the universe, you had different battle stations, you had different territories that operated as military campaign points and things like that, and the Earth was in a very strategic location. It was basically in a place to where if it were conquered, it could easily sway the tide of battle. And so what ended up happening here is the Kree saw the Celestials meddling with the genes of humanity, creating the Deviants and the Eternals. And so what they did is they took a subsect of humans and they modified their genes so that when these humans were exposed to the Terrigen mists, they would undergo a transformation into any number of races races, who in turn would go into those particular races, start civil wars, and allow the Kree to basically take over that planet and then continue their expansion of their own empire. Now, somewhere along the line, the leader of the Kree race, the Supreme Intelligence, realized that if this happened long enough, eventually it would lead to the Kree's own destruction. And so what ended up happening is the Supreme Intelligence ordered that all of these Inhuman projects be completely eliminated, and all of them were, except for 5. You had the Chameleons, you had the Badoon, and you had a handful of others. Of course, you had the Inhumans on the planet Earth. And so this represents the second of the 4 cities. And what happened is that these universal Inhumans, the races that exist way out on different parts of the universe, have decided that it's time to take over the planet Earth. Now, with regards to the 3rd city, this is what's called the Forever City. On the planet Earth, there is a guy named Herbert Wyndham, but most likely you've heard him referred to as the High Evolutionary. And he was a guy from the 1930s who was obsessed with genetics. He was actually a really big deal. He was really involved with the studies of Mr. Sinister. And we'll actually get to a discussion in my videos on a history of the Marvel Universe with regards to Mr. Sinister, because he was responsible for a lot of different things. He was responsible for Cyclops, the meddling of his powers when he was younger. He was responsible for the creation of the Weapons Plus project, which led to Captain America. It led to Wolverine. It led to Deadpool. Mr. Sinister was behind the motivation and why it is that we know that if Cyclops and Jean Grey ever had a child, it'd be wildly powerful. Mr. Sinister is behind a lot of things that have taken place in the realm of science in Marvel Comics as a whole. But because Herbert Wyndham, because the High Evolutionary was so obsessed with genes, what he ended up doing was basically performing experiments on himself. The problem with this was he was considered crazy by his contemporaries, by various scientists in the 1930s at the time, and so he was effectively ousted from the scientific community. And so he took up residence in a place called Wundagore Mountain, and what he did is he began basically modifying the genes of animals in order to to speed up their evolution, to basically make them human-like, so to speak. And the fact that they could talk, in terms of the fact that they were bipedal, so on and so forth. He had his group called the Newmen. Well, while all this was happening, he also had the intention of taking over the world. And so what he did is he went underground and he created a place called the Forever City. And the Forever City was basically a location whereby he had an evolution machine. It would allow him to basically speed up the evolution of all beings on the planet Earth, all of whom would swear allegiance to him because he would present himself as their leader. The problem with this was that when he activated the machine, he considered it a failure because of the fact that the machine actually forced those who were exposed to it to revert in evolution, meaning they would go backwards in evolution, they wouldn't go forward. And so he effectively abandoned the Forever City. And so as time progressed and various underground creatures like the Maloids and so on and so forth discovered this Forever City, they began calling it the Lost City of the High Evolutionary. This represents the 3rd city in the War of the 4 Cities. And the reason why is because those who are currently occupying this territory have decided that it's now their time to take over the surface world. Now, the final city in this discussion, and the one that actually leads directly into the death of Johnny Storm, is the Negative Zone and the forces of Annihilus. Now, what this does is this actually picks up after an event called Annihilation. Now, for those of you guys who never read Annihilation, it was a really, really good story, and it actually coincided with the events of Civil War. And it was really interesting the way these two stories compared and contrasted with one another. And the reason why is because the connection between the two was Richard Rider of the Nova Corps. And what had happened is that while Captain America and Iron Man were feuding on the planet Earth, in the Negative Zone, Annihilus had basically discovered the Negative Zone's equivalent of the power cosmic, the power that Galactus wields. And so because Annihilus is obsessed with killing everybody in order to ensure that he can't die, that no one can conquer him, Annihilus took over the Negative Zone and then invaded the main 616 universe and began unleashing a horde of its forces. It was called the Annihilation Wave, and it basically spread like a plague throughout the universe, conquering planets, killing everything that it came across. It was one of the most impressive displays of death and destruction in the history of Marvel Comics. Now, where this led, of course, to the capture of Galactus and different things like that going on, and there were a lot of themes that were taking place, and it even led into the formation of the Guardians of the Galaxy under Star-Lord. What ended up happening here is once Annihilus was defeated, he was basically confined back to the Negative Zone. He was basically stuck there. And so what ended up happening here is the Fantastic Four, the Future Foundation, and these various forces were going about their own normal business. But within the Marvel Universe, you had what I think was called the Court of the Negative Zone, or the Court of Annihilus, or something along those lines. But it was basically the remnants of the Annihilation Wave who had taken up residence on Earth and were operating to ensure Annihilus could actually come back and succeed in wiping out all life in the Earth 616 universe. And so what ended up happening is that because Reed Richards was the first person to discover the negative zone, because he's consistently had a portal that accesses the negative zone, the court had basically surrounded the Baxter building by virtue of jobs and businesses and so on and so forth, and then invaded the Baxter building and opened up the portal. And so for the first time in Hickman's run of the Fantastic Four, Franklin Richards lets everyone know that his powers have returned when he wipes out the forces of the Annihilation Wave, or the preemptive forces. But what happens is that the Future Foundation, Franklin Richards and Johnny Storm and those guys, go into the negative zone for the purpose of destroying Annihilus's forces to ensure that he can never invade the Earth 616 universe again. And so what happens here is that while they're doing the best they can, ultimately they're overwhelmed because Annihilus has billions of soldiers, billions with a B. He's got so many soldiers, it's unbelievable. And so what ends up happening is the Future Foundation basically bails out, but someone has to stay behind, and they have to basically lock the door and then randomize the access code so that no one can figure out how to gain access again. No one can get in and no one can get out. And so what ends up happening here is Johnny Storm stays behind. And this to me is one of the best moments in Hickman's run, because Johnny Storm he's not scared, he's not afraid, he doesn't care. He's angry and he's confident because he turns around and he says 1,000,000,000, and then he just says flame on, and then it immediately cuts to the end of the comic. Now, when this happened, when Hickman revealed that Johnny Storm was basically dead, it took the comic book world by storm. There's no better way to say that. It sent shockwaves. No, there had never been an instance when Johnny Storm had died, because the Fantastic Four just don't die. It doesn't happen. Sometimes the X-Men die, sometimes Captain America gives up. There's been a couple times where Captain America supposedly died, but it turned out he was alive. Thor died, and Thor disassembled during the events of Ragnarok. But the members of the Fantastic Four don't die. That's off limits. You don't kill them. And so it was a huge surprise to see Johnny Storm killed off. Now, that being said, with Johnny Storm being dead, with Fantastic Four issue number 588, Hickman gave us a comic that had no words. It was literally all just images, but I will tell you guys right now, this is one of the best comics that you're ever gonna see. And the reason why is because it literally just gives us stages. We don't have to read what's happening to know what's going on. And what's really interesting about this is that because Ben Grimm was the one that had to basically watch Johnny Storm die, that had to watch Johnny Storm sacrifice his life, this impacts Ben Grimm more than anything else. And what this does is it initially picks up with a call to arms. I mean, the Avengers, basically everyone shows up. Everyone's like, oh my God, Johnny Storm's dead. Because in the realm of Marvel Comics, the Fantastic Four are basically royalty, guys. It's like watching a prince, or a king or queen die. It's an insane thing to see. And so the superhero community, whether they're villains or otherwise, are in total shock. And so of course you have Thor, you have Wolverine, you have the new Avengers, more or less, Captain America, Iron Man. They show up and they visit the Future Foundation, they visit the Fantastic Four, and the response from Ben Grimm is he doesn't know what to do. He's just kind of lost here, because despite the banter that he and Johnny Storm had, the fact that they would bicker all the time, once you got past, what seemed to be bitterness between the two, all you found was love. Ben Grimm and Johnny Storm had a strong connection with one another because they were effectively the best of friends. And we knew that because when it came down to it, when it came down to the Fantastic Four fighting together, Ben Grimm had Johnny's back and Johnny had Ben Grimm's back. But now, in the eyes of Ben Grimm, no one's got his corner. No one is behind him. And so what happens is that when Susan Storm returns from her mission, she's told that Johnny Storm is dead. And again, the shock on her face is absolute shock and absolute, a crushing sensation, because once we get into day 3, we learn that with her brother being dead, she's spent almost the entire time isolated. She's been away from everybody. She will will not let Reed Richards touch her. She will not let anybody have anything to do with her. And so on day 4, Reed Richards goes to his weapons facility in the Baxter building and grabs the ultimate nullifier. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, the ultimate nullifier is a big deal. This thing is capable of just wiping out anything. Now, you know, what it destroys is relative to the drive, to the ambition, and the intelligence of the person who wields it. But because Reed Richards is in such an emotional state, and because he's so angry, and because he's so intelligent, he could simply press the button and wipe out the universe if he wanted to, and that's what he does. He goes to the portal of the negative zone. He effectively, you know, accesses it, as he's not able to cross through into the portal, but he can see into the inside, and he sees Annihilus, and he basically threatens him with the ultimate nullifier. And Annihilus just presents him with the shirt of Johnny Storm, and that's all it takes. That's all it takes. And so Reed Richards just kind of walks away. And so what we do is we move to day 5, which is effectively the funeral for Johnny Storm. And we see everyone here, almost every single superhero that's ever been important in the lives of the Fantastic Four are present here. And so as these individuals are talking to one another, as they're speaking with one another, Ben Grimm gets angry. Now, this I think is one of the absolute best moments of the story, because with the stages of grief, you know, the stages of dealing with someone who dies, anger is one of the most prominent and one of the most dangerous stages, depending on, you know, how close you were to the loved one that you lost. And so what ends up happening here is, of course, Dr. Doom actually vacates Latveria for a time. He puts Christopher Nard in charge, and he actually leaves and goes to pay his respects to the Fantastic Four. But we also see Spider-Man spending time with Franklin Richards. Now, this will be important because what's actually going to happen is there's going to be a story where Spider-Man works with Franklin on how to deal with the fact that Johnny Storm died. And this, again, is a really good story. If you ask Sal, if you go, you tweet Comic Pop and you ask him, what do you think about Spider-Man's, you know, conversation with Franklin Richards after the death of Johnny Storm, he'll tell you it's one of the best stories that he's ever read in the history of Marvel Comics. And so we switch over to Valeria Richards and the Future Foundation. And what's interesting, and what I hope you guys notice about this, is everyone's dealing with the situation in their own way. Initially, the Future Foundation have their own ideas. The thought is maybe we replace Johnny Storm with someone else, with She-Hulk, Storm, Black Panther, Wyatt Wingfoot, who has long since been an ally to the Fantastic Four and a close personal friend of Johnny Storm. But she erases all that and she says the only thing they need to do before they do anything else is kill Annihilus. And so what we do here, and this is why I think this is one of the best moments of the entirety of the story, is we pick up with Ben Grimm. And what happens is that on day 26, Ben Grimm meets with Bruce Banner and with Donald Blake, the human form of Thor. And of course, we see that Donald Blake has a stick, or his cane, which if he hits on the ground, it will turn into the hammer of Mjolnir, and he'll become Thor. And so what happens is they present him with with an image of Johnny Storm. And initially, Ben Grimm doesn't want to have anything to do with it. And so Donald Blake transforms into Thor, and he and Ben Grimm begin fighting one another. And then Bruce Banner changes into the Incredible Hulk, and they start fighting. All three are getting into a conflict, and they're battling. And initially, this seems as though they're picking a fight, but what they're doing here is they're letting Ben Grimm work out his anger. They're letting him work through his hatred and his rage, because Ben Grimm is so strong. If he were to freak out, and if he were to just start attacking anything, he would almost lay waste to the planet. But both Thor and the Incredible Hulk are two of the only people in existence who can withstand a beating from Ben Grimm almost completely unfazed. And so this is why I say this is such a great story, or such a great aspect of the story, because this is basically just Ben Grimm coping with the death of his best friend. And so what we do as we begin to wrap this up, as we begin to bring this to an end, is we join Reed Richards on day 29. And this is Hickman kind of bringing us back to reality. This is Hickman bringing us back to the story, saying, okay, you know, you guys have had your time to focus on the death of Johnny Storm. We have to get back to the bigger picture here. We have to get back to this great big huge story arc that he's giving us. And so while Reed Richards is going over his list of things, the idea that the negative zone may be invading the planet Earth, the idea idea that the Universal Inhumans want to conquer the planet Earth, Franklin Richards' power set. These are all important things that are, a major threat to them. Galactus possibly trying to consume Earth is a big deal. And for those of you guys who don't know, this harkens back to the original appearance of Galactus in Marvel Comics when he first met the Fantastic Four. The fact that Galactus was forced out on bad terms meant the possibility existed that Galactus could come back at any point in time and consume the Earth, and there would be virtually nothing the superheroes could really do to stop him. But more so than that, Reed Richards says that the reformation of the Council of Reeds is necessary. And this is something that I'd love for you guys to keep in the back of your head, because this will be very important later on down the line. But as this begins to come to a close, what happens is Reed Richards is met with the arrival of his father, Nathaniel Richards. So as we continue our discussion on Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four, we pick up now with what I consider to be one of the absolute best moments of the story. This sits right up there with the ending of Hickman's Fantastic Four, the conversation between, Galactus and Franklin Richards about how they'll both stand until the end of time. This is right up there. This is the segment of the story that deals with the conversation between Spider-Man and Franklin Richards. And what happens here is during this month of mourning, basically this 30 to 31 day period whereby all the members of the Fantastic Four and even some of the other superheroes in the Marvel Universe are dealing with the death of Johnny Storm, Spider-Man visits Franklin on a rooftop, and Franklin's just kind of here, just trying to understand everything that's going on. And what happens is he basically just starts relating to Spider-Man as a child. And this is why this is so good, because when you cast aside all the powers that Franklin Richards has, when you cast aside the fact that he can just make the universe whatever he wants it to be, the one thing he has to contend with when it comes to his powers is he cannot bring Johnny Storm back. He cannot resurrect Johnny Storm from the dead. And a lot of people will look at this and ask why. If he could resurrect Galactus, why could he not resurrect Johnny Storm? Because Galactus is a cosmic construct. He's an aspect of the universe. It would be like Franklin Richards, recreating a planet after that planet was destroyed. It's easy to do because it's just it's part of the cosmos. It's just the way things are. With Galactus, he's just an amalgamation of cosmic energies. And so to simply reconstitute those energies in a way that take on the form of Galactus with all the same memories and all the same views and experiences and so on is not difficult. But to recreate a human being who has a soul and whose soul has presumably passed on to the realm of the dead, Franklin cannot access that area. And so he's effectively trying to open a door or trying to get into a room through a door that he can't open. And so this is why it's so hard for him to deal with the fact that Johnny Storm has died. But more so than that, what's really interesting about all this is that Spider-Man tells Franklin the best thing to do is to just clear their heads, is to get away from spending so much time being down about the situation and to basically just sort of take a day for themselves. And so that's what they do. They end up going out and they get a hot dog with one another. And this is why I love Hickman's run of the Fantastic Four so much, because he does a great job of humanizing the characters. When we look at characters in Marvel Comics, we look at Captain America, we look at Daredevil, Iron Man, so on and so forth. For the most part, there's this wall that exists between us and them. We recognize they're fictional characters. They say whatever the writers want them to say. They do whatever the writers want them to do. But when you're going through Hickman's run of the Fantastic Four, it doesn't feel that way. And maybe I'm reading a little more into it than I probably should, but it doesn't feel like fictional characters to me. It doesn't feel like nonsense. They feel like genuine people with their own organic thoughts and desires and so on and so forth. And so what happens here is that, as short as this is, while the two of them are talking, Peter Parker reveals to Franklin that his uncle had died when he was younger. And what this does is it creates a very close relationship between the two of them because they're both coming from the same place. Franklin Richards lost his uncle, Johnny Storm. Peter Parker lost Uncle Ben. And because both of these individuals played such prominent roles in their lives, they have effectively, it kind of bridges the gap between the two of them. Now, there are some differences here, and Hickman doesn't shy away from these differences. He doesn't move away and try to ignore them. He actually embraces them here. With Uncle Ben, the value of Uncle Ben in the life of Peter Parker was not recognized until he was gone. It was the perfect example of you don't know what you have until it's gone. And Peter Parker talks about this. He says that he didn't really realize how close or how much he needed Uncle Ben until Uncle Ben was gone. With Franklin, it's similar, but it's not the same. Johnny Storm played a very active role in the life of Franklin, and he was around for quite some time. Of course, Johnny Storm was an active member of the Fantastic Four, went on a series of adventures, but more so than that, he and Franklin shared a very close relationship, more so than Spider-Man and Uncle Ben. Spider-Man looked at Uncle Ben as as a father figure, whereas Franklin looked at Johnny Storm for all intents and purposes as a brotherly kind of figure, really more of an extremely close friend than an actual relative. And so what ends up happening here is that as the two of them begin to go on, and this is why I love this story so much, Franklin says that he has a secret to tell Peter Parker. And when Peter asks him what it is, Franklin says he thinks he could have saved Johnny Storm. And this is so awesome because this really hits at the heart of Franklin struggling. It hits at the heart of him as a character. With all his vast abilities, he doesn't feel like he could have saved him, or he feels like he could have, but he didn't. And this is why he struggles so much, because Franklin could have easily saved him. Franklin could have simply used his powers, wiped away the entirety of the Annihilation forces, and saved Johnny Storm. But Franklin didn't, and he didn't because he's a child. Despite all the things that he's done in the past, all the crazy situations that have happened around him, they happened because he was able to think clear-headed. But in the situation that they were in, when the Annihilation wave was threatening to invade Earth, Franklin got caught up in the situation. He panicked, and he didn't quite know what to do. And so the result is that when he tells Spider-Man that he thinks he could have saved, Johnny Storm, Spider-Man replies by saying that he knows he could have saved his Uncle Ben. And this is so important for the realm of Spider-Man because it tells us that every single day, day in and day out, when he wakes up in the morning, when he hangs out with his friends, when he's fighting crime, when he is going to bed, Peter Parker sits down and realizes he could have saved the life of Uncle Ben. But then the question becomes, what if he had? What would Spider-Man be like if Uncle Ben had lived? Now, there is an actual story in Marvel Comics that deals with that, and it'd be kind of a cool story to run over one day. But for right now, for our discussion, this basically goes towards the statement that Peter Parker makes to Franklin in saying that the decisions that they make, the people that they meet over the course of their life, both good and bad experiences, shape them on a fundamental level. And what he says here is something I'd like you to pay extremely close attention to, because this will be a huge factor in why it is that Franklin Richards in the future was doing the things that he did. What Spider-Man says here is that because Uncle Ben died, he gained a valuable understanding of what it meant to do the right thing at the right time, to not be guided by anger, to not be guided by rage, to accept the fact that people make mistakes, that he's done things that he wished he didn't do, and there are things that he didn't do that he wished he had. And the result is that he has to live with that, but it's made him a better person. Much in the same vein, Franklin Richards dwells on the idea that he believes he could have saved Johnny Storm, and he most likely could have. But the fact that he didn't does not mean that Franklin is a failure. And this is what Peter's telling him, that he's not a failure as a human being. He simply he was in a situation, he was caught up, and he didn't quite know what to do. And so the result is that as this little segment of the story begins to wrap up, what ends up happening is Peter just sort of brings things to a close and takes Franklin Richards back home. And what this does is this leads us into the official launch of the Future Foundation story and Peter Parker becoming part of the Future Foundation. Now, for those of you guys who have seen various images of Peter Parker during your travels, where you've seen him in his white suit, basically dressed in this weird looking white suit, this is Future Foundation. This is Jonathan Hickman's run of the Fantastic Four. And what we do here is we transition to Reed Richards after this mourning phase is basically over. And what happens is he's watching an image of, or I guess a hologram, a message from Johnny Storm, basically telling them, yes, it sucks that I'm dead. Yes, it sucks that I'm not in your life anymore, but you guys got to move on. You guys got to look to the future. You can't dwell on the past. And so for Reed, while he's watched this video time and time again, it's helped him to sort of move forward. It's helped him to accept the fact that Johnny Storm loved them, that Johnny Storm sacrificed his life to protect them. And so in the end, the only thing they can really do is continue to move forward. And so what we do here is we pick up with Spider-Man officially joining, or I guess heading over to the Baxter building to meet with Susan Storm. And this is interesting because this is when the costumes of the Fantastic Four begin to change. And on its surface, Hickman doesn't immediately tell us what's going on. But even when he does tell us, he doesn't spend a whole lot of time doing it. There's not some huge grandiose explanation. It's not a storyline in and of itself. It's basically Susan Storm telling Peter Parker that after the death of Johnny Storm, that things needed to change. It didn't make any sense to wear costumes that had fours on them anymore because there weren't four of them anymore. Instead, there were only three because Johnny Storm had died. And so in order to both respect the memory of Johnny Storm, but also move into the future, they brought Peter Parker in to basically not necessarily take the place of Johnny Storm, but to be a temporary substitute. Now, the reason why this matters is because Peter Parker and Johnny Storm have a friendship that goes back a long time. In fact, the first real friendship that they had evolved out of the Amazing Spider-Man issue #1, when Peter Parker tried to join the Fantastic Four and they turned him down. But because of the fact that he spent time with them, because of the various crossovers where he fought alongside of them, a friendship began to bloom between the two of them. And so while I wouldn't go as far far as to say that they were like brothers. I will go as far as to say that for the Fantastic Four, it only made sense to have Spider-Man come in and step into this role. And this is really cool because the outfit that he gets is very similar in terms of what it's capable of to the Iron Spider armor. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, the Iron Spider armor is actually very anticipated in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. A lot of people believe that costume is going to show up. But the Iron Spider armor was a suit given to Spider-Man by Tony Stark when Spider-Man was fighting on Tony Stark's side during the Civil War event. And the Iron Spider costume allowed him to basically change his physical appearance. He actually took on the black costume from Secret Wars, and during the whole, I guess, prelude to the Venom saga, you know, it was just kind of a quick little scene, just give us a sort of idea of what the suit was capable of. But because of the fact that the Fantastic Four's outfits have been consistently composed of unstable molecules, that unstable molecule formula basically allowed Susan Storm to use her powers while she was in the suit. It allowed Reed Richards to stretch the suit and so on and so forth. But it also benefits in the sense that Spider-Man can sort of modify the suit to, I guess, suit his own situation, to sort of make it his own. And so what happens here is that as they're going about, as they're having their own conversations and they're sort of conversing with one another, what we end up doing is we actually jump to Pavlov, which is a prison, and that is where the Wizard is being held. Now, the Wizard originally appeared in the beginning of our discussion on Hickman's Fantastic Four, and we didn't really have a whole lot to say about him. Suffice it to say that he presented the catalyst for Reed Richards, recognizing that people are just bad and they're going to do bad things. And the only way to basically save the world was to solve the problem of everything, which initiated the whole Council of Reed storyline. But with this group called Advanced Idea Mechanics, which are sort of these enigmatic individuals who are bent on world domination through technological means, they have been brought in for the purpose of rescuing the Wizard. Now, we're not originally given an idea, we're not initially told why it is that this is happening. Instead, we see that the Fantastic Four alongside Spider-Man show up in their new getups with the new paint suits on the vessels and with their new costumes, and they basically go through and defeat Advanced Idea Mechanics, and they eventually get into a skirmish with the Wizard, although the Wizard is successfully able to escape. Now, what he says is that Reed Richards has something that belongs to him, and he's going to take it back. Now, what the Wizard is referring to is his son, quote unquote. The Wizard didn't really have biological children per se. Instead, he was a genius-level inventor who went through and created people. He created human beings of all shapes and sizes and then used them as an army to carry out his various schemes. But the child that he had created had been taken by Reed Richards when the Wizard was originally imprisoned, and that child is part of the Future Foundation, more or less being taught the various ideas of technology and how to make the world a better place, which goes directly in line with the Wizard's idea of dominating the world and taking away humanity's free will, owing to the belief that humanity would use its freedom to make its own decisions as a means to destroy itself. And so what ends up happening here is that once the Wizard and the various groups get away, we sort of see some banter back and forth, but we actually end up jumping back to the Baxter Building. Now, this is a really cool moment in the story, what happens here over the course of the next little while. And the reason why is because at the end of the last video, we had talked about how Reed Richards' father, Nathaniel Richards, had come back. And this was a very big deal because Nathaniel Richards had appeared off and on throughout the history of Marvel Comics, but he had never had a long-term role in his son's life. He had basically bailed out on Reed Richards when he was a child and then hadn't seen him for decades. Now, of course, we actually found out that it was because Nathaniel Richards, in relation to Reed, he was one of a multitude of Nathaniel Richards from across the multiverse that were pulled into this conflict, and they all started hunting each other down. And so Nathaniel was basically jumping from one reality to the next in order to keep himself alive. He was literally just on the run, trying to keep himself from dying. And so picking back up with the Baxter Building, it's the small things, I think, that really build Hickman's run into something special. And the reason why I say this is that with Peter Parker sitting down and getting ready to partake in the roast that's been cooked by Nathaniel Richards, he initially goes to sit down in Johnny Storm's spot, and Franklin says, "No, you can't sit there. That's Johnny's spot. You know, that is Johnny's place." And it's sort of just paying respects. You know, even though Johnny's not there, it's just kind of paying a respect and saying we have to keep Johnny's memory alive. Now, of course, this is designed to be a temporary thing, and as we'll find later on, these events with Johnny Storm aren't necessarily what they appear to be. But the fact remains that one of the funny little bits here is that while they're all sitting down for dinner, they actually say grace. Now, the reason why I like this is that while it's not really important and has virtually no bearing on the story whatsoever, it's funny to hear Franklin Richards say grace, because when you're a god and you can make your thoughts a reality, of what relevance are gods to you? Of what relevance are, other beings to you? Franklin Richards could easily destroy the Skyfathers. Franklin Richards is on par with the Celestials. Franklin Richards is as powerful as some of the most powerful beings in Marvel Comics. The only ones that really surpass him are like Eternity and Infinity, and even they might find themselves with a bit of a challenge when it comes to trying to take him head on if his powers were to fully manifest and reach the entirety of what it is that they were capable of. But again, this is just a little bit of a funny situation here. Nothing too big, just, you know, something that I thought you guys might enjoy a little bit. But what also happens is we get a little bit of the look of the Fantastic Four beyond the conflicts. And again, this is why Hickman's so cool, because he gives us, you know, the stuff between the pages, so to speak. Then of course, when Reed is talking about everything that's currently going on, about the Universal Inhumans and so on and so forth, the initial idea is, well, maybe they should terraform the moon, and that way they can give the Inhumans a place to live, as opposed to those individuals having to live on Earth. And where everybody else at the table says, yeah, sure, that's fine, that's a great idea, Nathaniel says that's stupid. And this is really funny, because Reed Richards has basically been in an environment for so long where everybody just agrees with him that it's refreshing to have somebody say, Reed, that's a stupid idea. Now, this doesn't mean that Nathaniel's being a dick. It simply means that everybody in the Fantastic Four is so used to how intelligent Reed is, very rarely would he say we should do something without having thought about it first. But even for Reed Richards, it's nice to have someone come along and say, you should not do that. That's silly. But at the same time, it's just a dad relating to his son. You know, and for Reed, it's good to have that feeling, because it's one that he has not felt for quite some time. And so as things begin to progress, as dinner begins to pass, what ends up happening is we see that the kids are put to bed and so on and so forth, and Nathaniel Richards and Valeria Richards meet with Reed for a conversation. Now, for those of you guys who did not see my last video, we had talked about how Valeria had traveled to Latveria to visit Dr. Doom, and she had made a pact with Dr. Doom that if Doom would assist in defeating Reed Richards, that she would help Dr. Doom fix whatever brain problem it is that he's suffering from. Now, the reason why he was suffering from a brain issue went into a story that was previously existing. We don't really need to go into that. You're welcome to watch the video if you want to see it. It seems like an unnecessary thing to add at this point into our discussion. But the fact remains here that Reed is not happy with this. Reed does not like the idea of associating with Dr. Doom because they've been enemies for so long, but also because Dr. Doom is a very nefarious person. Dr. Doom isn't necessarily someone who would trick people. He's a very honorable guy, which we'll actually find out here in a little while. But the fact remains that he's basically just a dick, and Reed doesn't want to have anything to do with that. But the fact remains that because Valeria thinks that it's a good idea, because Nathaniel's saying, hey, I've been in the future, this is something that needs to happen, in the end, Reed Richards more or less goes along with it. And so what ends up happening is, of course, we see them pick up with Dr. Doom. Now, Dr. Doom in the Fantastic Four, or in the Baxter Building, is one of the greatest moments in Hickman's run. And the reason why is because all he does is just give Ben Grimm a hard time. And this is such a great moment. You guys are going to get one hell of a kick out of this. So of course, Ben Grimm's reaction to finding out that Dr. Doom is in the Baxter Building is exactly what you'd expect it to be. You know, Ben Grimm just freaks. He's like, no way, no, that's ridiculous. Doom does not need to be here. He's our arch nemesis, you know. What's going on here? And of course, Reed says, no, it's fine. I allowed him to be here, you know, and then Doom starts taunting Ben Grimm. And of course, with Johnny Storm's death fresh in the minds of everyone, Dr. Doom, being Dr. Doom, decides to use that subject. And what he does is he asks Ben Grimm, he says, is it true that while Johnny Storm was facing off against a veritable horde of the Annihilation Wave, that Ben Grimm, surrounded by children, ran off and hid? And that just sends Ben Grimm right over the edge, and he loses his mind. Now, this is kind of important, because if Ben Grimm were to get his hands on Dr. Doom, he would probably kill him in this stage of complete rage. But because Susan Storm steps in, she sort of stops everything. She sort of just basically stops the two of them where they're at, using her ability to cast force fields. And the initial idea here is that no one really understands why Ben Grimm is here aside from Reed and Valeria and Nathaniel, and of course Doom himself. No one knows why he is allowed to be inside the Baxter Building, but the fact remains that Ben Grimm doesn't like what's going on. And so the result is, of course, he takes Dragon Man, and they end up leaving. Now, Dragon Man, we don't need to worry about. You guys are welcome to look him up. He's not really intricate for our discussion here, but he's just kind of like a mascot, so to speak, for the Fantastic Four, and they end up bailing out. Now, initially, Reed says, Susan, you should go spend time with him. figure out what's going on, try to get things sorted out. And her response is that Reed is an idiot for having Dr. Doom here. She doesn't know why he's here, and she's not happy about it. But the funny thing is that Doom's response is that in the end, his goal is to fix whatever problem it is with his brain, and it doesn't matter to him what else is going on, especially the thoughts and feelings of Susan Storm. And again, this is another perfect example of Hickman writing. Susan Storm's not putting up with any of Dr. Doom's shit. And what she says is that if he keeps mouthing off, she's going to send some air bubbles into his brain and reduce him to the intelligence level of a vegetable. And of course, Doom shuts up, which of course I would probably do the same. But the result is that, Spider-Man makes a couple jokes here and there, nothing too major, but we end up transitioning to the room, so to speak, what they call it, which is more or less kind of like the auditorium, the meeting hall where the Future Foundation gather together for their lessons under the direction of Reed Richards in order to solve various problems. And so, of course, with Peter Parker being inducted into the Future Foundation, the other members know who he is as a superhero, but they're not really acquainted with his intelligence. And so as soon as Peter Parker shows up, he immediately makes an impact by asking some very serious questions. Are the injuries of Dr. Doom in terms of his brain, are they physical injuries? That is to say, are portions of his brain missing? Is it simply psychological? Does he believe he's not able to access those portions of his brain? Or is it entirely possible that those portions of his brain, not necessarily physical, are simply just gone, that he just can't access those for whatever reason? They've been wiped from his mind in their entirety. And so while the rest of the Future Foundation is a little shocked at his intelligence, Valeria Richards chimes in and says that if the case is that his brain is structurally intact, that is to say, the physical structure of his brain has not been changed, then it's a very simple concept of Dr. Doom's brain basically just needs a reboot. That if there's a backup of all of his memories and his intelligence, they can grab that backup and they can use it. And this is a really funny moment here because Valeria is, of course, she's talking to Dr. Doom while Reed's listening on, and she says, we need a backup. And then Doom's just kind of like, yes, a backup, and then he's just kind of thinking for a second, and it seems like he doesn't really grasp what it is that's going on. And they just kind of, look at one another for a second, and Doom asks Valeria if she's trying to annoy him, and she just sits there for a second or two, and then she says, I said we need a backup. And then Doom finally figures out what it is she's talking about. This isn't really huge, but I love this kind of thing. I love this kind of thing in comics because it makes them human. This is the kind of thing that you would see and you would laugh at if you saw it happen in real life. And so to me, it was just a really great moment. But what we do here is we pick up in Latveria proper. Now, once we're in Latveria, what we find out is that this entire situation is actually going to rely on the character of Christophe Bernard. Now, initially, when I was going through this, and I'd actually forgotten some of the writing that Hickman had done here, I was trying to figure out a way to add Christophe Bernard into our explanation. But the great thing is that we don't have to, because Jonathan Hickman basically gives us that. He essentially gives us the rundown of, who Christophe Bernard is. And what we're told is that at some point in the history of Latveria, there was a rebellion that was orchestrated. And while Dr. Doom was able to quell the rebellion, Christophe Bernard was a child who was orphaned by the death of his parents. And so what ended up happening is Dr. Doom took Christophe Bernard as his own, but did this for a couple reasons. One, because Dr. Doom probably felt bad for him, although within Marvel Comics, assuming anybody's actually writing Dr. Doom the way he should be written, he would never admit to that. But the other half was that Dr. Doom wanted a backup. He wanted to make sure that if something happened to him, if he died, that his legacy would be carried on through an heir. And so what he did is he took all of his memories, all of his intelligence, all the knowledge that he had on the dark arts, on science, on technology, and put it into the mind of Christophe Bernard. Now, while this does make Christophe Bernard intelligent, the best way to think about this is if his brain was a computer, then all the stuff of Dr. Doom, everything that makes up who Dr. Doom is like a file sitting on that computer somewhere. It's just waiting to be retrieved so that it can be used in a situation just like this. And so what happens is that after activating a piece of machinery, the mind of Dr. Doom is basically restored back to its normal self. Now, of course, Reed Richards up to this point was not aware of the fact that a pact was struck between Valeria and Dr. Doom. He simply thought that they were going to help fix Dr. Doom because it's just the right thing to do because Reed is not a terrible human being. But once Reed is filled in on the situation and once he's told that the entire basis behind this was at the behest of a pact, what we find out is that healing Dr. Doom, fixing Dr. Doom was done for the purpose of having Dr. Doom defeat Reed Richards. Now, what we'll learn later on is he's not actually going to be facing off against this Reed. He's going to be facing off against the Council of Reeds, which is going to make for one hell of a story. So as you guys can probably tell from the length of the video, this is a big one. And the reason why is, of course, we missed a video for the last couple days, but that's because I've been trying to find a way to basically bring this whole segment of Hickman's Fantastic Four into order. And the reason why is because if you guys watched my last video, I had basically told you that from that point going forward, things were going to explode. It was going to get absolutely crazy, and Hickman was going to start grabbing these different ties, and he was going to start bringing them all together. And so for those of you guys who were kind of curious about where the whole plot thread of the War of the Four Cities was going to, this is where we find out. We find out this is basically where things are sort of wrapping up. Now again, for those of you guys who didn't see that video, the War of the Four Cities was a premonition given to Valeria Richards, the genius daughter of Reed Richards, by the future version of Franklin Richards. And what Franklin said is that there will be a War of the Four Cities. And we didn't know exactly what it was that he was referring to. At the time, Hickman hadn't really unveiled everything. But as the stories progress so far over the course of our discussions, what we know is that there are groups of Inhumans that exist beyond the Earth. And of course, the Inhumans were experiments by the Kree for the purpose of exposing different races to the Terrigen Mist, who in turn would morph into various races in and of themselves. They might have powers, they might not. They all serve different kinds of purposes, but the goal was to basically use the Inhumans as a way to infiltrate different races across the cosmos, allowing the Kree to take over those races and expand their own empire. That was the premise behind the Inhumans on Earth. What we learned was that our Earth Inhumans were not the only ones. There were other Inhumans from across the cosmos, from across the universe, who had received this same treatment, and they were considered to be the universal Inhumans. And a time had come when they had basically made the argument that it was time for them to take over the Earth, to make Earth their rightful place. Now, as far as I'm aware, Hickman doesn't really give us a reason why, except to say it's just part of the story, and we can just kind of take it, for what it is. We don't really need to read too much into that. But the second of these groups was, of course, the members of the Forever City, which was a city basically created by the High Evolutionary, a man who lived his life according to the premise of evolving himself and others as best he could. And so the result was that he created something called the Ascension Engine, which basically jump-started the evolution of various people who stepped into that city, whether they were extremely primitive in the form of moles themselves, or whether they were human beings. It would basically speed up their evolution to the next stage. Now, the next group after that was, of course, Atlantis. And Atlantis, as we know, or at least those of you guys who are relatively familiar with Marvel Comics know, is that's where Name of the Submariner comes from. Well, of course, because Atlantis had been around for thousands and thousands of years, if not, millions of years, you had old Atlantis, which was ruled by a group of those individuals who held on to old beliefs. And the idea was that they were going to overthrow the new Atlantean Empire led by Name of the Submariner, and they were going to basically take the surface back. And so this led to the whole involvement of Susan Storm being a sort of go-between for Name of the Submariner to deal with the old Atlanteans, and for the old Atlanteans to be kept in check to keep from seeing their plans of taking over the world coming to fruition. Now that said, the fourth group came in the form of Annihilus, his forces that existed in the negative zone, and all they wanted to do was basically open a portal to Earth and to conquer Earth along with the rest of reality. They were pretty straightforward and the easiest to understand. So again, to sort of rehash this, our first group was the Universal Inhumans, our second group were the occupants of the Forever City, our third group was Old Atlantis, and our fourth group was, or I guess is, Annihilus and his forces. Now what we're going to see is that with this coming to fruition, because of the fact that Valeria Richards had accessed the portal that had been created by Reed, whereby he encountered the multiversal versions of himself in the form of the Council of Reeds, when she did this, what we find out is that she basically escaped alongside these other Reeds when the Mad Celestials were still laying waste to the council chamber. And so we have about 4 or 5 different versions of Reed from this council who are within the main Earth 616 universe of Marvel Comics. And so what we do here is we pick up with Dr. Doom. We pick up with the fact that he again is basically going to help Reed destroy him, or at least destroy these other Reed Richards. And so once we begin to get into this, we basically see that invitations are being sent out to various people, of course to the High Evolutionary, to Diablo, to the Mad Thinker, to the Wizard. And one thing I'd like you to take note of here is that these invitations are being sent out to some of the most formidable, or at least some of the oldest villains of the Fantastic Four. And there's a reason for this. Because of the fact that this council has effectively been assembled for the purpose of defeating Reed Richards, who better to reach out to than the people who have fought him for so long? And so the idea is to bring all their minds together for the purpose of using their experience to destroy Reed. But what happens is that once this council convenes, the Watcher appears. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, before the Watcher was killed in the original sin leading up to Secret Wars, whenever the Watcher showed up at an event, it meant that shit was going to pop off, is basically the best way to put it. Things were going to go crazy, and he always appeared during a time when something would take place that would affect the universe. And this is Reed's reaction. Because of the fact that the Watcher's here, because Valeria was the one who set about the idea of having all these villains come together, of bringing Dr. Doom on for the purpose of defeating Reed, and because of the fact that Valeria had gone through the portal, Reed Richards' reaction is, what has she done? She basically set in motion a series of events that will reshape the entire landscape of the Marvel Universe. And so what we do here is we actually pick up several months after this council originally convenes, and we join with the different versions of Reed Richards from the Council of Reeds as they're going around to these different 4 cities. And initially we pick up with the old Atlanteans, and what we find is that one of these Reeds is creating subversion within the old Atlanteans themselves. Because the Atlanteans were composed of different tribes, what he does is he basically says one tribe was going to betray the other, and he's effectively just planting the seeds of civil war, planting the seeds of dissent among these old Atlanteans. Now from here, we jump to the Forever City, and what happens is we pick up with this version of Reed, who basically says that the entire premise here is to effectively use this ascension engine that was created by the High Evolutionary as an engine of sorts, to basically power a device that they're going to create. Now we'll find out what this device is here in a little bit. At this point, we basically find out that this Reed is meeting with Mole Man, the person who originally discovered this. And the reason why this is important is because there's a lot of manipulation and a lot of subterfuge going on here. What Mole Man says is that the problem he faces is various moloids, that is to say, those weird looking organisms that are subservient to him. They have been leaving him, and they've been going to the Forever City, and they've been having their evolution jump started. And the more this happens, the more moloids leave. And so the bargain that's being struck here is that if Mole Man will basically work with this Reed, then they will effectively, he'll effectively set it up so that his moloids won't leave anymore. They won't be able to access the city. And so what we do at this point is we jump into the realm of another one of the Reeds who's talking to the Universal Inhumans. And what happens is, this is actually a perfect example. I'd like you to keep this in the back of your mind because this will be important for the battle that happens later on. But what happens here is this Reed initially becomes extremely arrogant. And what I mean by that is he goes into the situation not thinking about the consequences. He wants to again be manipulative. He effectively wants to pit the Inhumans in a war against the other 4 cities. That's really where all this comes from. But because of the fact that he's going against a telepath from the Centauri race, who are well known for their telepathic prowess, his mind is read more so than he expects, and they immediately detect subterfuge. And so what happens is they set about basically imprisoning him, interrogating him, studying his mind, and finding out exactly what the full scope of their plan is. And so finally, the last Reed that we pick up with before we begin to wrap back around to events that are currently transpiring is this Reed, this meeting with the Cult of Annihilus. Now again, the Cult of Annihilus was a group that existed within the main Earth 616 universe, but they worshipped the concept of Annihilus. And so once this version of Reed begins speaking with Annihilus himself, the question is, if they help Annihilus, what does he want in return for his help? And so Annihilus says, the only way he'll help this Reed is if Reed opens the portal to the negative zone and then leaves it open, allowing Annihilus's forces to come pouring in. Now again, I know we're kind of grabbing things here, and I know it may seem a little off in terms of where it is that we're coming from and why these things are being done, but what Hickman does is he starts wrapping these different things up together. And what we're told is that these Reeds are basically building something called Saul's Anvil. And Saul's Anvil is a very important concept in Hickman's Fantastic Four, and I want you to keep this in the back of your head because this will become very important, especially when we start dealing with the situation of Galactus. But what we learn is that in order for Saul's Anvil to work the way it's supposed to, It requires a lot of different things. But the reason why old Atlantis was getting special attention was because these reeds required a hyperthermal vent, basically meaning it was a way for them to access water stores or to use superheated water in order to allow the energy that would be put off by Saul's anvil to vent out of the planet instead of simply just blowing that energy down into the planet and then cracking it in two. The other part of this was that they required the Ascension engine to basically power it. They required the Annihilation forces to keep the forces of Reed Richards and the various superheroes of Earth at bay, to keep these individuals from conflicting with their plans, and they required the Universal Inhumans to be another component for this Saul's anvil that would actually allow them to go forward into the universe, beginning to sort of conquer it and for them to serve their purpose. And so what we do here is we jump back to the Council of Doom. We jump back to this gathering of these various villains of Reed Richards' past and their plans to defeat the remainders of the Council of Reeds. And what's really interesting about this is it basically throws into sharp relief the problem that these villains have. Of course, they don't really fight amongst each other. We'll see some of that happen later on. But the bigger issue here is they're not looking at the situation for how it is. They're looking at the situation for how they want it to be. What Reed says here is that Valeria opening that chamber set up a series of events that simply just can't be undone. There's no way to get past this anymore. And the other half of this is that the villains begin looking at it as though they're facing off against Reed Richards himself. But what Reed says is that these members of the council are not like him. They gave up their family. They gave up their friends. They gave up virtually anything that could be used against them. Their singular purpose, their one goal, is to basically take over the universe and then find a way back home and continue their role of controlling the multiverse in and of itself. And so what happens is Nathaniel Richards basically steps up and says, this is their weakness. This is the problem that everybody's not looking at. They're looking at it like they're facing Reed, but they're not. They're facing totally different individuals who have common goals. They have common themes, but the weakness that they have is their desperation. Their weakness is the fact that they want to get back home. And so the easiest way to defeat them is to prevent that from happening. And so while Reed Richards and the various individuals don't necessarily grasp what it is that Nathaniel's saying, Nathaniel says, what is it Reed would do? If Reed were in a situation that he didn't think he could get out of, if Reed were in a situation where he seemed overwhelmed by the events that were transpiring and he wanted a way to sort of let his mind wander in order to keep himself preoccupied but also focus on the variables as well as the facts, what would he do? And Reed says, they're building a machine, which of course we know to be Saul's anvil. And so what happens here is Valeria says, yes, she knows about it. Yes, she knows about that device, but the first step in order for them to acquire this is to basically get to old Atlantis. And so what happens is the Fantastic Four, I guess the Future Foundation at this point, begin to head out to old Atlantis. But while this is happening, Susan Storm has also been summoned to old Atlantis because of the fact that the subterfuge that version of Reed had been working on, the one that had been planting the seeds of civil war, has basically come to fruition, and the old Atlanteans are fighting amongst themselves. And so what happens is that while Susan is there, and while Susan, Spider-Man, and a couple other members of the Future Foundation help to basically fight off these forces, in the end, they appear to be overwhelmed. In addition to this, they're joined by the forces of the Mole Man, and so it's basically a situation where everybody is against the Fantastic Four. But more so than that, because Reed isn't there to necessarily explain everything that's going on, as the conflict begins to unfold, the alternate reality version of Reed Richards, the one that was part of the Council of Reeds and was sowing the seeds of civil war, reveals himself. And to Susan's eyes, this is her husband. This is the actual Reed Richards, and so she's very confused and she's absolutely baffled as to what's going on. And so what happens is this evil version of Reed plays on that. He takes that idea that Susan is momentarily distracted and effectively attacks her. And so while she's temporarily incapacitated, of course she's not severely injured and she's not dead, Spider-Man tends to her, and Alex, one of the members of the Future Foundation, does what he can to basically take out these forces, or at the very least to keep them at bay and to keep them from destroying the city of old Atlantis. And so while he's not necessarily successful, owing to the fact that that version of Reed is able to take old Atlantis away, is able to whisk it away and open up this thermal vent for access, what we do is we pick up with Reed Richards in one of the most dangerous situations that any man could be in, dealing with an angry wife. And so what happens here is, as he's talking to Susan Storm, Her question is, when Spider-Man was telling Reed about everything that was going on with that battle, Reed was not really shocked when he said an alternate reality version of himself had taken old Atlantis away. The question she has is why? Why was he not shocked? Why was he expecting to hear something like that? And so he effectively sits down and tells her everything that's going on. He tells her that he opened a portal to basically solve the problem of everything, that he walked through that portal, that he encountered alternate reality versions of himself from all across the multiverse, that they had all abandoned their families, they had left their wives and children, they had left their friends behind, and that the Celestials from an alternate reality had effectively laid waste to that council, and that Reed was not willing to take those same steps, and effectively left. He disbanded or seemed to abandon the council in favor of keeping his family. And so what we do here is we jump to the Forever City of the High Evolutionary. And again, we see more of these Reeds spending time with one another, and this is where the bargain begins to come into play. If these individuals who are part of the Forever City, if they will close their doors off to the Mole Man and to the Moloids who would otherwise seek to enter the city, then these Reed Richards will work on a way to ensure the long-term survival of these members of the Forever City. And the reason why is because with their evolution being jump-started the way that it is, they're still not able to procreate the way they need to because that facet of them just isn't available. It's not worked into their genes. That's one of the reasons why evolution works the way it does, is to ensure things begin moving in a forward direction naturally. But because they were artificially sped up, their bodies don't function right. And so because of that, if these Reeds are able to effectively cure them, then it won't be a problem anymore. In order for them to achieve access to this improvement on their physiology, they also have to basically work on the machine and fix it so that it'll go back to its previous standard. That way the Reeds can enhance it to their desires in order to make it work the way they want it to. And so what happens here is that as they're working on this Saul's Anvil, as they're working on this machine, we're ultimately, I guess, met with the return of Earth's Inhumans. And the reason why this matters is because with Earth's Inhumans having been gone during an event called the War of Kings, which dealt with Vulcan, the third Summers brother, who's an Omega level mutant, seizing control of the Shi'ar Empire, and Black Bolt, who led the Kree Empire, waging war against one another, it opened the stage, it opened the platform for the Universal Inhumans to try to acquire Earth in the first place. And so with the Inhumans back, with the Inhumans looking at both these Universal Inhumans as usurpers, as well as the actions of these various Reeds going in direct conflict with what it is that they wanted to achieve, we eventually see that these Inhumans begin to just wage war. They effectively just begin crushing every single person who would otherwise seek to oppose them or usurp their position. Now, this is actually really cool, and the reason why this is interesting is because this is in direct opposition to the kind of Inhuman stories that we're getting right now with Marvel Comics. The Inhuman stories that we're getting at the moment really aren't that great, but this run of the Inhumans give them a dynamic aspect. They give them range, they make them interesting, they make them intriguing because they have motivation, they have desire, as opposed to just kind of being people who were there. But the fact remains that we basically joined the versions of Reed temporarily as the Inhumans start to lay waste to the city, as they just begin killing off every single occupant, every single person that's there. Now, what we do here is we actually take a break for a second and we jump back to the Baxter building. And I know it really feels like we're jumping around a lot. I know it feels like we're bouncing around a lot, but there's going to be motivation behind this, and there's going to be a reason, because this is going to clear up a lot of stuff and it'll let us move forward without having to worry about any of these lingering things. But picking up with Susan Storm, we see her meeting with Nathaniel Richards. And this is interesting here. It's not a super important thing, but it's interesting here. And the reason why is because it tells us that Susan Storm doesn't really trust Nathaniel. Yes, he is playing it smart. Yes, he's giving them information from the future, but in her mind, the future is not written in stone. The future is not guaranteed. But for Nathaniel, he knows their future is guaranteed. And so in terms of their ideologies, it's the perfect example of an unstoppable force meeting an immovable object. But the other half of this, though, is we have to remember that Susan Storm is operating on information given to her by the future version of her daughter Valeria, where Valeria said that dark times are coming, that hard times are coming, and that no matter what happens, Susan is going to have to stay strong. And so to this moment, I guess at the very least, it seems as though this is what Susan is doing. She's staying strong in the face of the fact that it would be so much easier to just give in to Nathaniel and just say, yes, you're right, okay, fine, we'll do whatever you tell us to, as opposed to trying to avoid him or trying to block his every turn. And so what we do here is we transition away from the Baxter building and we pick up with Reed Richards and the Council of Doom after the conflict in the Forever City. And what happens is that as they're going through, of course, they have force fields to protect themselves from the radiation of the Ascension engine, which has been given to them by Dr. Doom. Again, if this force field wasn't there, their evolution would just jumpstart, and who knows how they would turn out. But as they begin to go through and as they begin to investigate, what they also do is they have a plan. And their plan is to effectively take out each individual version of Reed that's present here and to remove them from the situation, to basically conquer their plan. And so as they're going through and as they're pulling these things off, one of the coolest moments in Dr. Doom actually happens here. While Reed Richards is fighting alongside the Council of Doom, he's actually taken away by Medusa and by Lockjaw, who of course is an Inhuman that teleports people away. But during this conflict, Dr. Doom encounters one of the versions of Reed, and Reed initially says, you have no business being here, you have no business, in conflicting with our plans, and Dr. Doom just slaps him across the face and says, do not speak again unless it's to answer my questions. This is not a huge deal, it's not major to the story, it's just great to see Dr. Doom doing this kind of stuff. But while Doom is interrogating this alternate reality version of Reed, he's actually attacked from behind by the Mad Thinker and Diablo. Now, the reason why Hickman gives us this is because while this will go towards, the wrapping up, so to speak, or the tying up of loose ends with regards to the Council of Doom, it's also a great homage to the history of the Fantastic Four, that when it comes down to it, the Mad Thinker and Diablo are very basic. They're B, C, D level villains. They're nowhere near Dr. Doom in terms of popularity or even in terms of capabilities. And this is proven by the fact that Dr. Doom, after being attacked, turns around and he basically says, you would try to kill me with fire. Of all things, they try to kill him with fire. And he turns around and he says, world be damned, Doom endures. And for those of you guys who don't really read comics that much, if this is your first experience with Dr. Doom and Marvel Comics, this is why we as comic book fans love Dr. Doom, because he's got the best lines ever. He's so arrogant, but he's so cool at the same time. And so what happens is that because the Mad Thinker is a villain that prides himself on analyzing the entirety of a situation, because he prides himself on the idea that no one else seems to understand or seems to analyze the same variables he does, and he believes himself to have always come out on top because of that, he tries to pull this with Doom. He basically tries to barter the life of Diablo. He says that if Doom, accounts for the variables that no one expects, if he is a caring and a giving individual, if he's a compassionate person, then that would change the situation. Nobody would see that coming, and Doom should do that. And Doom says no, and he basically just seems to kill Diablo here. And so what happens is that as we jump back to Attilan, as we jump back to the Inhumans, we see, of course, the arrival of Spider-Man, of Nathaniel Richards, and of the main Earth 616 Reed Richards. And this is really interesting here. This is really cool because this is classic Inhumans here. But for those of you guys who aren't really familiar with the previous Inhumans, the way they existed before Secret Wars, you had Black Bolt, who was the leader who couldn't speak because his voice would kill anybody that he spoke to. But you also had Medusa, who spoke for him just by reading his body language and so on and so forth. But with the character of Medusa and with Black Bolt, what we learn here is that their actions of laying waste to everyone that seems to be usurpers is basically just inhuman justice. This is just the way it is. The Inhumans themselves don't really go about, traditional justice the way that we would do it in terms of human society. We don't put people on, or they don't put people on trial. They don't, have them, determined to be guilty or innocent by a jury of their peers. They just kill stuff. They just wipe things out. It's just how they do it. It's really not, something to read too deep into. It's just the way they do things. But the fact remains that with the Inhumans going through and attacking virtually everybody, that the Wizard and his advanced idea mechanics henchmen seem to vacate. They seem to basically bail out. And so what we do here is we pick up with a High Evolutionary who gets to the Ascension engine, and he says that this is basically basically been modified, it's been adjusted. Yes, it's been adjusted beyond his expectations, but it doesn't serve the purpose that it was originally designed to serve anymore. It's basically been transformed into a power source. And so while there are a few things that happen here and there, while Reed Richards is basically made to look on and watch as the events unfold in the Forever City, we of course see the insane brother of Black Bolt, Maximus the Mad, going through and attacking people. And this is just kind of some fun stuff. This is really just a little bit of filler things that are given in here. But overall, the arc here is that the various versions of Reed, almost all of them are defeated. They're basically defeated and taken prisoner by the Inhumans. And the reason why I say almost all is because while Doom is initially invited to the Inhuman city, he of course turns it down. And the reason he turns it down is because he spots one of the Reeds who has not been captured yet, who's basically watching the events unfold. Now, something I'd like you to take note of is, for those of you guys who have not been watching or not seen my Hickman video so far, yes, this version of Reed has an Infinity Gauntlet, but because he's in a universe that's not his own, the Infinity Gauntlet doesn't work here. Why he continues to wield the Infinity Gauntlet, I'm not really sure. It seems to be a part of his character in the same way that Professor X has a wheelchair, that Dr. Doom has a metal suit. It's just part of who he is, but it also helps us to distinguish between this version of Reed from the Council of Reeds and our main Earth 616 Reed. But what ends up happening is that while Doom goes against this version of Reed, that version of Reed responds by saying that he's fought Doom countless times. You know, he's fought an infinite number of Dooms on an infinite number of worlds. He knows every move that Doom is going to make before he even makes it. And this is interesting because with Dr. Doom as a villain, he prides himself on his intelligence. But what this version of Reed is saying is that Doom is predictable, that he's really not as smart as he believes he is, that if given enough time, he himself is nothing if not a series of patterns. He's nothing if not a guy that just does the same thing over and over again, which is actually Hickman telling us this is the reason why Doom gets beat all the time, because he keeps using the same schemes all the time. But the fact remains that this Reed uses one of those collars that was used to turn all the versions of Dr. Doom into vegetables, and he puts it around Doom's neck. But what we also learn is that the collar does not automatically turn a person into a vegetable. Instead, he turns the collar down so that Doom is effectively just made his slave under the threat that if Doom does not do what he's told, that the collar is going to be turned up to max power. And so again, what we do is we go back to the city of Attilan, and we pick up with Reed and we pick up with Nathaniel and Spider-Man as this entire conflict is sort of wrapped up. And so for those of you guys who may have gotten a little confused or a little lost in the conversation so far, the overall gist here is that the Reeds of the council were basically creating Saul's Anvil, a way to open a dimensional rift in order to access their own world and in order to access the council. But the only way they could do that was to use aspects of the four cities. And so while they attempted to do what they could by implanting subterfuge, in the end, they were defeated when the Inhumans showed up and just cleaned house. And so with this event coming to an end, or at least with this aspect of the story coming to an end, what we find is that Reed, Nathaniel, and Spider-Man are presented with Eldrak. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, not all Inhumans who were exposed to the Terrigen Mist become powerful people. Not all of them become like Black Bolt or Medusa. Some of them become the dog Lockjaw, others become Eldrak, which is a door that takes you wherever you need to be. It doesn't mean that it'll take you where you want to go, it'll take you where you need to go. And so it basically reads you on a very subconscious level, but there's also some veiled illusions here that maybe the door of Eldrak also understands, you know, the future, or it understands how things will turn out, and it basically takes you where you need to go in accordance to how the universe is supposed to unfold and what future events are going to be taking place. Again, Hickman doesn't give us a whole lot here on this. We're kind of left to our own devices to interpret exactly how the door functions with regards to the need of the person that travels through it. But the fact remains that once Reed and Nathaniel and Spider-Man go through this door, we pick up with Reed Richards and his arrival back at the Baxter building. Now, this is extremely important to the future of events that happen, especially during Nathaniel's conversation with Reed Richards, which will actually probably be coming here in the next, 2 or 3 videos or so. And what happens is once he gets back to the Baxter building, he's there with Susan, and he tells her everything that's going on, the entire conflict with the Inhumans, how they went through Eldrak, and Eldrak took them where they needed to be, and he says that apparently he just needed to be here. He just needed to be with his wife. And this is a big deal, because what Susan says is that by reiterating what Valeria told her, that dark days are coming, and that even if Valeria had not visited Susan Storm, and even if Valeria had not told Susan Storm that that dark days were coming, Susan would know it simply just by intuition. And that's a legitimate claim. You know, I wouldn't go as far as to say Susan Storm has precognition or anything like that, but I will say that she seems to have always been accurate in terms of her ability to perceive that things aren't the way they're supposed to be. And so what she tells Reed, and again, this is extremely important, that Reed seems to have gotten lost in his attempt to solve the problem of everything, with the realization that the Council of Reed members, or at least some of them, had made it into his universe, the attempt to stop him, that maybe he's fighting a losing battle, that maybe these events are just supposed to unfold, and all Reed can do is watch them unfold to their fruition, and then try to stop some final event that occurs at some point in the future. Now again, this is something that I really want you to keep in the back of your head, because we will reference this, especially when we see the return of the adult Franklin Richards. But because of the fact that the actions of these various Reeds still leave on the chess table the possible invasion of Annihilus, it brings to light the fact that the Earth itself is still in extreme danger. And so what happens is that while Ben Grimm had departed the Fantastic Four for a time to basically kind of focus things in light of Johnny Storm dying, what he does is he returns at the behest of Spider-Man, but he brings the Avengers with him. And so what we do here is we pick up in the Baxter building itself, and we basically join Reed Richards. And all Reed really does is effectively explain everything that's going on. He tells them everything that's happening, the fact that Dr. Doom appears to have been taken prisoner by one of the Reeds. He tells them about the Council. He tells them about all these events unfolding, and that while Reed did what he could, while he did what he thought was the right thing to do, this is ultimately all just backfired. And so he's effectively assembled the Avengers, or at least a huge number of the Avengers, in order to combat this threat. And we see the creme de la creme of Marvel Comics here, some of the most powerful and popular Avengers. We of course see Iron Man, we see Luke Cage, Iron Fist, we have Carol Danvers, we have Wolverine, we have Red Hulk, we have Doctor Strange. We have some pretty powerful folks here, you know, with regards to their own right. We also see a few X-Men, and this really presents a circumstance whereby things could really begin to go crazy. Things could really begin to pop off. And the reason why I say that is because during the event of War of Kings, the Supreme Intelligence had been destroyed. And if you guys recall my discussion on the Inhumans, we had talked about how the Supreme Intelligence had the entire Inhuman project decommissioned because of the fact that the Inhumans would at some point in the future rise up against the Kree Empire and destroy it. And so what happens is with these versions of Reed being taken prisoner by the Inhumans themselves, they're effectively handed over to Ronan the Accuser, who is really like the steward of the Kree Empire, while Black Bolt is not there. And so these two Reeds are handed over to Ronan the Accuser, and they are brought together. Their minds are effectively melded together, and they are transformed or transmogrified into the Supreme Intelligence. And so because the Supreme Intelligence has basically returned and encompasses all the knowledge of all the Kree rulers that have ever existed, he also now has the knowledge of these two Reed Richards to go along with it, meaning this Supreme Intelligence is now knowledgeable on a multiversal scale, not just a universal scale. But the fact remains that because of the fact that the Supreme Intelligence had been dead for so long, that in the end, the goal is to still destroy the Inhumans. And so what happens is the Supreme Intelligence sends forth the armada of the Kree race, sends them all towards the planet Earth. And this comes on the heels of the Avengers going forward with the intention of facing off against the forces of the Annihilation Wave, assuming they advance, facing off against the remainders of the various members of the Council of Reeds who are still running around the planet Earth. And so in response to the fact that the Kree could very well destroy the entirety of the human population, Reed Richards basically sends out an SOS, and in response to this SOS is the arrival of Galactus. With that being said, we're going to bring this video to an end, and the reason why is because those of you guys who read Hickman's Fantastic Four, you guys know that in the next video, which will be out tomorrow, things get crazy. Anyway, guys, we're going to wrap this up. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know what you guys think about Hickman's Fantastic Four so far, because if you guys have had a few jaw-dropping moments so far, it ain't nothing compared to what comes out in the next video. I know you guys hate cliffhangers. I'm sorry. I got to do it to you. But yeah, I'll catch you guys later. Peace.